Genesis chapter 31 verse 1. And he heard the words of Laban's sons, saying, Jacob hath taken away all that was our father's, and of that which was our father's hath he gotten all this glory. In this verse, we find ourselves in the midst of Jacob's journey. Jacob had been living and working for his uncle Laban for 20 years. During this time, God had blessed Jacob, causing his flocks to increase greatly. Laban's sons became envious of Jacob's prosperity and accused him of taking away their father's possessions. This verse reveals a couple of important themes and lessons that we can extract from Jacob's story. God's blessing and provision. Despite Laban's sons' accusations, Jacob's increase in wealth was not due to deceit or theft but was a result of God's blessings upon him. It serves as a reminder that God is the source of our provision, and He can bless us even in difficult circumstances. The presence of jealousy and envy. Laban's sons' reaction to Jacob's prosperity highlights the destructive nature of jealousy and envy. Instead of celebrating Jacob's success, they allowed these negative emotions to cloud their judgment and make false accusations against him. This serves as a warning for us to guard against jealousy and envy, which can harm relationships and lead to further strife. Facing challenges in life. Jacob's journey wasn't always smooth. He faced trials and tribulations, including his difficult relationship with Laban. This verse reminds us that challenges are a part of life, but with God's presence and guidance, we can navigate through them. Trusting in God's faithfulness. Throughout Jacob's story, we see God's faithfulness and protection. Despite Laban's mistreatment and the envy of Laban's sons, God watched over Jacob and ensured his well-being. This verse encourages us to trust in God's faithfulness and believe that He will guide us and provide for us in every situation. In summary, Genesis chapter 31 verse 1 teaches us about God's blessing and provision, the destructive nature of jealousy and envy, facing challenges in life, and trusting in God's faithfulness. It reminds us to rely on God, even in difficult circumstances, and to guard our hearts against negative emotions that can lead to strife. Genesis chapter 31 verse 2. And Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban, and, behold, it was not toward him as before. Genesis chapter 31 verse 2 is part of the narrative about Jacob's departure from Laban's household. To understand the verse in its context, let's explore the preceding events. Jacob had been living with Laban for several years and had worked for him. During this time, Jacob had entered into a contractual agreement with Laban to marry his daughters, Rachel and Leah. However, Laban had deceived Jacob by giving him Leah instead of Rachel as his wife. Jacob had also experienced mistreatment from Laban, who constantly changed his wages. In Genesis chapter 30 verse 1, we see that Jacob's flocks had multiplied significantly, and he desired to return to his homeland. Sensing the growing animosity of Laban's sons towards him, Jacob felt it was time to leave and go back to his family. This sets the stage for Genesis chapter 31 verse 2. In this verse, it says, And Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban, and, behold, it was not toward him as before. Here, countenance refers to Laban's facial expression or his overall attitude and demeanor towards Jacob. The phrase, as before, indicates that Laban's disposition had changed. It was no longer the same as it had been in the past. This change in Laban's attitude towards Jacob is significant. It reflects the deterioration of their relationship and sets the context for Jacob's decision to leave. Laban's treatment of Jacob had become increasingly unfavorable, and his true character had been revealed through various deceitful actions. This verse can teach us several lessons. The consequences of deceit. Laban's deceitfulness towards Jacob ultimately strained their relationship. Deception can harm trust and create discord, leading to negative consequences. God's faithfulness. Throughout this narrative, God remained faithful to Jacob, protecting and prospering him despite Laban's mistreatment. God's faithfulness is a constant theme throughout the Bible, reassuring us that even in difficult situations, He is with us. Recognizing changing relationships. Jacob's observation of Laban's countenance serves as a reminder to pay attention to the shifts in our relationships. Noticing changes in attitude can help us address conflicts, make amends, or even make decisions, like Jacob did, to move on from toxic environments. God's guidance in difficult circumstances. As the story continues, we see that God instructs Jacob to return to his homeland. This demonstrates God's guidance in our lives, leading us out of challenging situations and towards his purposes. In summary, Genesis chapter 31 verse 2 reveals a turning point in Jacob's relationship with Laban. It highlights Laban's changing attitude and sets the stage for Jacob's decision to leave. The verse reminds us of the consequences of deceit, God's faithfulness, the importance of recognizing shifting relationships, and the guidance of God in difficult circumstances. Genesis chapter 31 verse 3, "And the Lord said unto Jacob, Return unto the land of thy fathers, and to thy kindred, and I will be with thee." This verse is part of the narrative in the book of Genesis that describes the events surrounding Jacob's departure from his uncle Laban's house and his return to his homeland. To understand the significance of Genesis chapter 31 verse 3, it is helpful to examine the context and the broader themes of this passage. In Genesis chapter 31, we find that Jacob had been working for his uncle Laban for a significant period of time. During his time there, Jacob had married Laban's daughters, Leah and Rachel, and had acquired a considerable amount of wealth in terms of livestock. However, Jacob's relationship with Laban had become strained, and Laban's sons were becoming jealous of Jacob's prosperity. Consequently, Jacob discerned that it was time to leave Laban's household and return to the land of his fathers. In verse 3, we see that the Lord speaks to Jacob and gives him a command to return to the land of his fathers and to his kindred. This divine instruction is accompanied by a promise, "And I will be with thee." This promise of God's presence and protection underscores the significance of this verse. Obedience to God's command. The verse highlights Jacob's obedience to God's command. Despite the challenges and uncertainties he faced, Jacob chose to heed God's call and return to the land of his fathers. This emphasizes the importance of responding to God's instructions in our own lives, even when the circumstances may seem difficult or uncertain. Divine presence and protection. God's promise to be with Jacob is a reassurance of his presence and protection. This promise reveals God's faithfulness and his commitment to Jacob as he embarks on this journey. It also serves as a reminder that God is with his people, providing guidance and support in times of transition and uncertainty. God's faithfulness and covenant. The verse also reflects God's faithfulness to his covenant with Jacob and his ancestors. God had made promises to Jacob's grandfather Abraham and his father Isaac, and now he reiterates his commitment to Jacob. By instructing Jacob to return to the land of his fathers, God continues to fulfill his promises and demonstrate his faithfulness to the covenant he established with the patriarchs. Overall, Genesis chapter 31 verse 3 highlights the importance of obedience to God's commands, the assurance of his presence and protection, and his faithfulness to his covenant. It serves as a reminder that God's guidance and promises are available to his people as they navigate life's journeys. Genesis chapter 31 verse 4, "And Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field unto his flock." This verse is part of the larger narrative of Jacob's departure from Laban's household, as he prepares to return to his homeland with his wives, children, and livestock. Let's explore this verse in the context of the surrounding passage to gain a deeper understanding. In Genesis chapter 31, we find Jacob working for his father-in-law, Laban, tending his flocks. Over time, Jacob becomes prosperous, and Laban's sons begin to grow envious of him. Additionally, God had instructed Jacob to return to his homeland, Genesis chapter 31 verse 3. Recognizing the increasing tension and God's calling, Jacob decides to leave Laban's household secretly. In verse 4, we see that Jacob sends for his wives, Rachel and Leah, to join him in the field where his flock is located. The significance of this action lies in Jacob's intention to communicate his plan of departure and to seek their agreement and cooperation. Jacob involves his wives in his decision-making process and invites them to play an active role in their family's future. This verse highlights a few important aspects. Jacob's leadership. Jacob takes the initiative to gather his wives, demonstrating his leadership and responsibility as the head of his household. He seeks to involve them in important decisions, emphasizing the importance of unity and collaboration in a family. Communication and transparency. Jacob calls Rachel and Leah to the field to share his plans openly. By doing so, he ensures that they are aware of his intentions and can discuss and contribute to the decision-making process. This act of open communication promotes trust and fosters a healthier relationship within the family. Consideration for the well-being of his family. Jacob's decision to leave Laban's household and return to his homeland would have significant implications for his wives and children. By involving Rachel and Leah in the discussion, he acknowledges their concerns, perspectives, and emotions, recognizing that they too have a stake in the matter. The field as a gathering place. The choice of the field as the meeting place holds symbolic significance. The field is where Jacob's flock is located, representing his livelihood and material wealth. By calling his wives to the field, Jacob associates their presence and involvement with the prosperity and future of their family. In summary, Genesis chapter 31 verse 4 portrays Jacob's leadership, open communication, consideration for his family's well-being, and the symbolic significance of the field as a gathering place. This verse reminds us of the importance of involving our loved ones in important decisions, fostering unity, trust, and shared responsibility within the family. Genesis chapter 31 verse 5. And said unto them, I see your father's countenance, that it is not toward me as before, but the God of my father hath been with me. Genesis chapter 31 verse 5 is part of the narrative in which Jacob, also known as Israel, prepares to leave his father-in-law Laban's house and return to his homeland. This verse is significant as it reveals Jacob's observation of Laban's changed attitude toward him. Let's explore the context and the broader themes within this verse. To fully grasp the meaning of Genesis chapter 31 verse 5, it is essential to understand the preceding events. Jacob had been living with Laban for a significant period, serving him through various agreements and facing trials and tribulations. Over time, Jacob's growing wealth and prosperity had become a source of contention between him and Laban. Jacob, through the guidance and blessing of God, had acquired a substantial number of livestock and possessions. This created jealousy and animosity from Laban and his sons toward Jacob. In this verse, Jacob gathers his wives, Leah and Rachel, and shares his observations with them. He explains that he has noticed a change in Laban's countenance, meaning his facial expression or demeanor. Jacob discerns that Laban's attitude toward him has shifted unfavorably. Laban's countenance is no longer as pleasant or favorable as it once was, suggesting a growing hostility or resentment. Jacob attributes this change in Laban's attitude to the presence and intervention of the God of his father, referring to the God of Abraham and Isaac. Jacob acknowledges that God has been with him throughout his time in Laban's household, protecting and guiding him. Despite Laban's shifting attitude, Jacob acknowledges the divine favor that has accompanied him, assuring him that God is aware of the situation and remains faithful to him. This verse demonstrates Jacob's growing awareness of the spiritual dimension of his life. He recognizes that his prosperity and well-being are not solely dependent on human relationships or circumstances. Instead, Jacob acknowledges God's providence and involvement in his life, attributing his success and protection to the presence of the God of his father. From a broader perspective, Genesis chapter 31 verse 5 emphasizes the theme of divine intervention and faithfulness. It highlights how God's presence and blessings can shape and influence our circumstances, even in the midst of challenges and changing human attitudes. Jacob's recognition of God's hand in his life serves as a reminder that our ultimate trust and reliance should be placed in God, rather than solely relying on human relationships or external factors. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 31 verse 5 captures Jacob's discernment of Laban's changed countenance and the recognition of God's continuous presence and faithfulness in his life. It reminds us to be aware of God's involvement in our circumstances and to place our trust in Him, knowing that His providence surpasses the shifting attitudes and challenges we may encounter. Genesis chapter 31 verse 6. And ye know that with all my power I have served your father. Context: Genesis chapter 31 tells the story of Jacob's departure from Laban, his father-in-law. Jacob had worked for Laban for 20 years, during which time he acquired wealth and a large family. However, Laban's sons became jealous of Jacob's prosperity, and tensions arose. In this verse, Jacob speaks to his wives, Rachel and Leah, reminding them of his faithful service to their father. Faithful service. Jacob acknowledges that his wives were aware of the efforts he had put into serving their father. Throughout his time with Laban, Jacob had demonstrated his dedication and diligence in tending Laban's flocks and managing his possessions. This verse highlights Jacob's commitment and hard work. Trustworthiness. By emphasizing his faithful service, Jacob seeks to assure his wives that they can trust him. Laban's sons had accused Jacob of stealing their father's wealth, but Jacob affirms his innocence and reminds Rachel and Leah of his years of loyalty. He wants them to know that he has been responsible and reliable in his duties. Integrity. Jacob's statement reflects his integrity and honesty. Despite the mistreatment and deception he experienced from Laban, Jacob did not retaliate or act dishonestly. Instead, he continued to work diligently and faithfully. This verse showcases Jacob's character and his commitment to fulfilling his responsibilities. Lessons for us. Genesis chapter 31 verse 6 teaches us the importance of integrity and faithful service. Jacob's example encourages us to maintain our integrity even when faced with difficult circumstances or unfair treatment. It reminds us that our character and actions can have a lasting impact on those around us. God's faithfulness. Although not explicitly mentioned in this verse, it is worth noting that throughout the story of Jacob, we see God's faithfulness and provision. Despite the challenges Jacob faced, God protected him and blessed him abundantly. God's faithfulness serves as a backdrop to Jacob's faithful service, reminding us that our trust in God enables us to navigate difficult situations with integrity. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 31 verse 6 captures Jacob's affirmation of his faithful service to Laban. Through this verse, we learn about Jacob's integrity and dedication, and we are reminded of the importance of maintaining our own integrity even in challenging circumstances. Genesis chapter 31 verse 7. And your father hath deceived me, and changed my wages 10 times, but God suffered him not to hurt me. This verse is part of the story of Jacob and his relationship with his father-in-law, Laban. To fully understand Genesis chapter 31 verse 7, it is important to explore the context leading up to this verse. Jacob had been working for Laban for many years, tending to his flock. Laban had 2 daughters, Leah and Rachel, and Jacob had married both of them. During his time working for Laban, Jacob had experienced numerous challenges and difficulties. In the preceding verses, Jacob recounted to his wives, Rachel and Leah, how Laban had changed his wages multiple times. Each time Jacob and Laban negotiated an agreement, Laban would alter the terms to his own advantage. Despite these manipulative tactics, Jacob acknowledged that God had intervened and protected him from being harmed by Laban. This verse highlights several important aspects. Deception and manipulation. Jacob acknowledges that Laban had deceived him and altered his wages multiple times. Laban's actions were unfair and dishonest, reflecting his character. God's protection. Jacob recognizes God's providence and intervention in his life. Despite Laban's attempts to harm him through deceitful practices, God did not allow Laban to prevail. Trust in God's faithfulness. Jacob's statement reveals his trust in God's ability to protect and provide for him. He acknowledges that God's intervention prevented Laban from causing him harm. This verse serves as a reminder of God's faithfulness and His ability to protect His people, even in the face of deceit and manipulation. It demonstrates the importance of relying on God's guidance and trusting in His provision, especially in challenging circumstances. As we reflect on Genesis chapter 31 verse 7, we can draw lessons from Jacob's experience. We should strive to maintain integrity in our dealings with others and trust that God is always watching over us. Even when faced with difficult situations and people who may seek to deceive or harm us, we can find comfort in knowing that God is in control and will ultimately protect and provide for us according to His perfect plan. Genesis chapter 31 verse 8. If He said thus, "The speckled shall be thy wages," then all the cattle bear speckled, and if He said thus, "The ringstraked shall be thy hire," then bear all the cattle ringstraked. This verse is part of the narrative of Jacob's departure from Laban's household. To fully understand the significance of Genesis chapter 31 verse 8, it is essential to provide some context. In Genesis chapter 30, we read about Jacob's dealings with Laban regarding the flocks of sheep and goats. Jacob had served Laban for 20 years, marrying his daughters Leah and Rachel and fathering many children. However, Jacob desired to leave Laban and return to his homeland. He proposed an agreement to Laban, which is described in Genesis chapter 30 verses 25 through 34, where Jacob proposed that he would separate out any speckled, spotted, or dark-colored sheep and goats from Laban's flock as his wages. Laban agreed to this arrangement. Genesis chapter 31 verse 8 refers to the fulfillment of this agreement. Whenever Laban would change the terms of the agreement, saying that the speckled or ring-straked, streaked animals would be Jacob's wages, all the animals in the flock started to bear the corresponding characteristics. It seemed as though God was supernaturally intervening to bless Jacob and fulfill His promise. This event demonstrates God's providence and faithfulness towards Jacob. It shows that God was with Jacob and blessed his efforts, ensuring that he received what was rightfully his. The significance lies in the fact that the outcome of the flock's appearance was not due to natural causes but was a result of divine intervention. God was working behind the scenes, faithfully fulfilling His promises to Jacob. This passage also emphasizes the principle of honesty and integrity. Laban had changed Jacob's wages multiple times, trying to take advantage of him. However, Jacob remained faithful to the original agreement and continued to work diligently. God's intervention and blessing were a testament to Jacob's faithfulness and integrity. As we reflect on Genesis chapter 31 verse 8, we can draw some practical lessons for our own lives. First, we are reminded of God's faithfulness in fulfilling His promises. Even when circumstances may seem uncertain or challenging, we can trust in God's provision and guidance. Secondly, we are encouraged to maintain our integrity in all situations, just as Jacob did. Even when faced with dishonesty or unfairness, we should strive to remain faithful and true to our commitments. Lastly, this passage also invites us to recognize and acknowledge God's hand in our lives. Like Jacob, we should be attentive to God's blessings and recognize His involvement in even the smallest details of our journey. In summary, Genesis chapter 31 verse 8 reveals God's faithfulness to Jacob and highlights the importance of integrity in our dealings. It teaches us to trust in God's provision, maintain our integrity, and acknowledge His involvement in our lives. Genesis chapter 31 verse 9. Thus God hath taken away the cattle of your father, and given them to me. Context and background. Genesis chapter 31 verse 9 is part of the narrative of Jacob's departure from Laban's house. Jacob had worked for his uncle Laban for 20 years and had acquired significant wealth, particularly in terms of livestock. However, Laban and his sons became jealous of Jacob's prosperity, and the relationship between Jacob and Laban grew tense. In response, God instructed Jacob to return to the land of his fathers, and Jacob prepared to leave secretly with his wives and children. Understanding the verse, in this verse, Jacob is speaking to his wives Rachel and Leah, explaining to them the dream he had the previous night. In the dream, God appeared to Jacob and gave him instructions to leave Laban's house and return to his homeland. Jacob acknowledges that it was God who took away the cattle from Laban and gave them to him. Key themes and lessons. God's sovereignty. The verse highlights God's sovereignty and his ability to intervene in human affairs. Jacob recognized that it was God who orchestrated the transfer of wealth from Laban to himself. It is a reminder that God is ultimately in control and can bless or redirect our circumstances according to his divine purposes. Divine provision. The verse emphasizes God's role as a provider. Throughout Jacob's time with Laban, God blessed Jacob, causing his flocks to increase. When it was time for Jacob to leave, God ensured that Jacob had the resources necessary to establish himself independently. It serves as a reminder that God is faithful and can provide for his people in unexpected ways. Trust in God's guidance. Jacob's obedience to God's instruction to leave Laban's house demonstrates his trust in God's guidance. Despite the challenges and uncertainties that lay ahead, Jacob followed God's leading, confident that God would fulfill his promises. It encourages us to trust in God's guidance even when the path is unclear, knowing that he is faithful to his word. Faithfulness in adversity. The verse also reflects the theme of faithfulness in the face of adversity. Laban and his sons had grown envious and treated Jacob poorly. Yet, Jacob remained steadfast in his commitment to God and continued to fulfill his responsibilities diligently. It serves as a reminder to maintain integrity and faithfulness to God, even when facing challenging circumstances. Application. Recognize God's sovereignty. Reflect on the ways God has been at work in your life, guiding and providing for you. Acknowledge his sovereignty and trust that he is in control of your circumstances. Trust God's provision. When facing challenges or uncertainties, remember that God is your provider. Seek his guidance and trust that he will supply your needs according to his will. Obey God's leading. Be attentive to God's instructions and promptings in your life. Trust in his guidance and be willing to step out in faith, even when the path is unclear. Remain faithful in adversity. In times of difficulty or mistreatment, strive to maintain faithfulness and integrity. Trust in God's justice and rely on his strength to navigate challenging situations. Remember to read the surrounding verses and consider consulting additional commentaries or resources for a deeper understanding of the passage. Genesis chapter 31 verse 10. And it came to pass at the time that the cattle conceived, that I lifted up mine eyes, and saw in a dream, and, behold, the rams which leaped upon the cattle were ring-straked, speckled, and grizzled. Genesis chapter 31 verse 10 is part of the narrative about Jacob's departure from Laban's household. To understand this verse in its context, let's explore the surrounding verses and the broader story. In Genesis chapter 31, we find Jacob working for his uncle Laban, tending to his flocks. Jacob had made an agreement with Laban to receive specific kinds of livestock as his wages. However, Laban continuously changed the terms of the agreement, which resulted in Jacob feeling mistreated and manipulated. In verse 7, Jacob recounts a dream he had, where God instructed him to leave Laban's household and return to his own land. Jacob understood this dream as a sign from God, directing him to leave and promising to be with him. In verse 10, Jacob tells his wives Rachel and Leah about another dream he had. He shares that when the flocks were breeding, he looked up and saw the rams that were mating with the flock. To his surprise, the rams were ring-straked, speckled, and grizzled. These terms describe patterns and colors on the animals' coats, indicating some unusual and distinctive markings. This dream about the mating of the flocks is significant because it foreshadows what Jacob will later do to increase his own wealth. In the subsequent verses, Jacob explains that he has noticed how Laban's treatment has been unfair. He reveals that he has devised a plan to increase his own flock by breeding the animals with the ring-straked, speckled, and grizzled markings, which were not typical among Laban's flocks. The dream, therefore, serves as a catalyst for Jacob's decision to leave Laban's household and also provides him with a strategy to build his own wealth as God had promised. The dream and the markings on the animals serve as a divine sign and encouragement to Jacob, assuring him of God's presence and guidance in his life. This episode in Jacob's life teaches us several lessons. First, it reminds us that God is aware of our circumstances and can use dreams and signs to guide us. Jacob recognized the significance of the dream and acted upon it, trusting in God's direction. Second, it highlights the importance of discernment and wisdom in making decisions. Jacob observed the physical characteristics of the rams and used that information to formulate a plan that would ultimately benefit him. However, we should also note that Jacob's success was not solely due to his own cleverness but was ultimately a result of God's blessing and providence. Finally, this story emphasizes the faithfulness of God in fulfilling his promises. God had previously promised to be with Jacob and to bless him, and we see the fulfillment of that promise as Jacob's flocks increase despite Laban's attempts to deceive him. Genesis chapter 31 verse 11. And the angel of God spake unto me in a dream, saying, Jacob. And I said, Here am I. This verse is a part of the account of Jacob's departure from Laban's household. To understand its significance, let's examine the context and key themes surrounding this verse. In Genesis chapter 31, we find Jacob working for his father-in-law, Laban. Jacob had agreed to serve Laban for a total of 14 years in order to marry his daughters Rachel and Leah. Over time, Jacob's wealth increased, which caused tension and jealousy among Laban's sons. God saw Jacob's situation and instructed him to return to the land of his fathers, to the land of Canaan. It is within this context that the verse in question takes place. In a dream, the angel of God spoke to Jacob, calling out his name and saying, Jacob. Jacob's response was immediate and submissive, Here am I. This brief dialogue signifies Jacob's readiness and willingness to obey the divine command to leave Laban and return to his homeland. There are a few significant themes to consider in this verse. Divine communication. The angel of God communicates with Jacob in a dream, revealing God's direct involvement in Jacob's life. This divine communication underscores God's interest and concern for his people, guiding them in their journeys and decisions. Obedience. Jacob's response, Here am I, reflects his obedience and readiness to follow God's command. Despite the challenges he faced and the uncertain future ahead, Jacob exhibited trust and submission to God's leading. God's faithfulness. This verse highlights God's faithfulness in guiding and directing Jacob's life. God had promised to be with Jacob and bless him, and now he was orchestrating Jacob's departure from Laban's household. It serves as a reminder that God remains true to his promises and actively works in the lives of his people. Jacob's identity. The angel of God addresses Jacob by name, acknowledging his identity. This personal encounter affirms Jacob's significance and role within God's unfolding plan for the nation of Israel. It reminds us that God knows us individually and calls us by name, inviting us into a personal relationship with him. Overall, Genesis chapter 31 verse 11 captures a pivotal moment in Jacob's life, where he hears from God through an angelic dream and responds with obedience. This verse highlights the themes of divine communication, obedience, God's faithfulness, and the recognition of Jacob's identity within God's plan. It encourages us to trust in God's guidance, respond willingly to his calling, and rely on his faithfulness as we journey through life. Genesis chapter 31 verse 12. And he said, Lift up now thine eyes, and see, all the rams which leap upon the cattle are ring-straked, speckled, and grizzled, for I have seen all that Laban doth unto thee. This verse is a part of the narrative in the book of Genesis that describes the story of Jacob and his dealings with his father-in-law, Laban. To fully understand the significance of Genesis chapter 31 verse 12, it is helpful to provide some context. In Genesis chapter 31, we find Jacob living with Laban, his uncle, and working for him as a shepherd. Jacob had married Laban's daughters, Leah and Rachel, and over time, he had acquired a considerable number of flocks. However, Jacob noticed that Laban and his sons were becoming increasingly envious of his prosperity and treated him unjustly. In the midst of this situation, God spoke to Jacob and instructed him to return to his homeland, the land of Canaan. In verse 12, God appears to Jacob in a dream and reveals a plan to increase his wealth and prosperity. God instructs Jacob to "Lift up now thine eyes, and see, all the rams which leap upon the cattle are ring-straked, speckled, and grizzled." This observation was significant because it revealed a method by which Jacob could increase his flocks while countering the deceitful practices of Laban. The meaning behind the vision is that God had noticed all the injustices done to Jacob by Laban. The description of the rams being ring-straked, speckled, and grizzled refers to their physical appearance, which made them distinct from the rest of the flock. God was showing Jacob a method by which he could selectively breed the sheep, ensuring that he would receive the speckled and spotted lambs as his own. This plan enabled Jacob to establish a fair agreement with Laban regarding the division of the flocks. By breeding the sheep with specific characteristics, Jacob could secure a portion of the livestock for himself and provide for his own family's well-being. This divine intervention was a manifestation of God's faithfulness and care for Jacob, even in the midst of challenging circumstances. In a broader sense, this verse illustrates God's sovereignty and intervention in the affairs of His people. It serves as a reminder that God sees and understands our circumstances, even when we face adversity. It also emphasizes the importance of seeking God's guidance and relying on His wisdom in navigating difficult situations. Overall, Genesis chapter 31 verse 12 demonstrates God's provision and faithfulness to Jacob, while also conveying important lessons about trust and reliance on God's guidance in challenging circumstances. Genesis chapter 31 verse 13. I am the God of Bethel, where thou anointedst the pillar, and where thou vowedst a vow unto me. Now arise, get thee out from this land, and return unto the land of thy kindred. In this verse, we find Jacob receiving a message from God regarding his departure from Laban's household and the land of Haran. To understand the significance of this verse, it's helpful to provide some context. Jacob had been living with Laban, his father-in-law, for several years. During this time, he had faced many challenges and experienced both blessings and hardships. Jacob had married Laban's daughters, Leah and Rachel, and had become prosperous through his flocks and herds. However, Laban's treatment towards Jacob had grown increasingly unfavorable, and it was time for Jacob to leave and return to his homeland. At this crucial moment, God appears to Jacob in a dream, reaffirming His presence and guidance. Let's break down the verse to gain a deeper understanding. I am the God of Bethel. Bethel was a significant place for Jacob. Earlier in Genesis chapter 28, Jacob had a profound encounter with God at Bethel. It was there that he had a dream of a ladder reaching to heaven, and God made a covenant with him, promising to bless him and his descendants. By identifying himself as the God of Bethel, God reminds Jacob of the divine encounter and the promises made at that place. Where thou anointedst the pillar. When Jacob first arrived at Bethel, he took a stone and set it up as a pillar, pouring oil on top of it as an act of consecration. This anointing symbolized Jacob's recognition of the sacredness of the place and his commitment to God. It served as a memorial of the encounter with God and the promises made. God's mention of the anointed pillar serves to remind Jacob of his previous dedication to God and the significance of that commitment. Where thou vowedst a vow unto me. At Bethel, Jacob made a vow to God, promising that if God would be with him, protect him on his journey, and provide for him, then the Lord would be his God, and Jacob would give 1/10 of everything he possessed back to God. This vow expressed Jacob's devotion and trust in God's faithfulness. God's reference to Jacob's vow reinforces the importance of honoring one's commitments to God. Now arise, get thee out from this land, and return unto the land of thy kindred. Here, God directs Jacob to leave the land of Haran and return to the land of his ancestors, where his family resided. God instructs Jacob to rise and depart from his current circumstances, indicating a new phase in his journey and a separation from Laban's household. In summary, Genesis chapter 31 verse 13 captures a pivotal moment in Jacob's life. God reminds Jacob of his identity as the God of Bethel, the significance of the anointed pillar, and the vow Jacob made. Through this reminder, God encourages Jacob to leave Laban's land and return to his own people. It serves as a reminder of God's faithfulness, guidance, and the importance of honoring one's commitments to him. This verse also emphasizes the role of God's divine intervention in Jacob's life, providing him with direction and assurance as he faces a new chapter in his journey. Genesis chapter 31 verse 14. And Rachel and Leah answered and said unto him, Is there yet any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? This verse is part of the narrative of Jacob's departure from Laban's house. Jacob had been working for Laban for several years and had acquired a significant amount of wealth through his diligent efforts. However, Laban and his sons began to resent Jacob's prosperity and treated him unfairly. In this particular verse, Rachel and Leah, Jacob's wives, express their frustration and concern over their father's attitude towards them and their husband. They question whether there is still any share or inheritance left for them in their father's house. This inquiry reflects their uncertain and insecure position in their father's household and their desire for a fair distribution of assets. This verse highlights the cultural and social context of the time, where inheritance and property rights were significant concerns. In ancient Near Eastern societies, the eldest son typically received the majority of the inheritance, leaving little or nothing for the younger sons and daughters. Rachel and Leah, being Laban's daughters, were likely aware of this cultural norm and wondered if they had any remaining rights or claims to their father's possessions. The larger context of this passage reveals that Jacob decided to leave Laban's household after experiencing mistreatment and oppression. God had instructed Jacob to return to his homeland, and Jacob shared this divine guidance with Rachel and Leah. They expressed their support for Jacob's decision to leave and acknowledged their own difficult position in their father's household. This verse raises important themes of inheritance, fairness, and the role of family dynamics in biblical narratives. It also underscores the challenges faced by individuals in ancient societies regarding property rights and the need for justice and equity within familial relationships. Overall, Genesis chapter 31 verse 14 portrays Rachel and Leah's concern for their future and their recognition of their limited prospects within their father's household. It contributes to the larger narrative of Jacob's journey and serves as a reminder of the cultural context in which the biblical characters lived. Genesis chapter 31 verse 15. Are we not counted of him strangers? For he hath sold us, and hath quite devoured also our money. This verse is a part of the narrative of Jacob's departure from Laban's household. Jacob had been working for Laban for 20 years, serving him in exchange for his daughters Rachel and Leah. However, Jacob's relationship with Laban had become increasingly strained, as Laban continually changed Jacob's wages and mistreated him. Consequently, Jacob decided it was time to return to his homeland, taking his wives, children, and possessions with him. In this particular verse, Rachel and Leah express their feelings of alienation and frustration. They perceive themselves as strangers to their father, Laban, despite being his daughters. They also accuse Laban of treating them like outsiders and not valuing him as family members. Furthermore, they mention that Laban had sold them and consumed their dowry, referring to the deceitful circumstances surrounding their marriages to Jacob. This verse reveals the dissatisfaction and resentment that Rachel and Leah harbored towards their father. It also sheds light on Laban's dishonest and manipulative behavior. The narrative as a whole emphasizes the complex dynamics within families and the consequences of deceit and mistreatment. From a broader perspective, this verse reminds us of the importance of treating our family members with love, respect, and fairness. It serves as a cautionary tale against manipulation, dishonesty, and the mistreatment of others, especially within the family unit. Moreover, it highlights the consequences of such actions and the impact they can have on relationships. As we study this verse, we can reflect on our own relationships and examine whether we are treating our family members with the honor and love they deserve. It reminds us of the need for open communication, trust, and compassion within our families. Ultimately, this verse prompts us to strive for healthy and harmonious relationships, following the principles of love and kindness as exemplified in the teachings of the Bible. Genesis chapter 31 verse 16. For all the riches which God hath taken from our father, that is ours, and our children's. Now then, whatsoever God hath said unto thee, do. In this verse, we find Rachel and Leah, the wives of Jacob, discussing their relationship with their father, Laban. To fully understand the context of this verse, it's helpful to explore the preceding events. Jacob had been working for Laban for many years and had acquired wealth in the form of livestock and possessions. However, Laban's attitude toward Jacob changed, and he began to treat him unfairly. God revealed to Jacob that it was time to return to his homeland, Canaan, and Jacob shared this with his wives, Rachel and Leah. In Genesis chapter 31 verse 16, Rachel and Leah express their agreement with Jacob's decision to leave Laban. They acknowledge that God has blessed Jacob and taken wealth from Laban, which they see as rightfully belonging to them and their children. They affirm their support for Jacob's decision by saying, Now then, whatsoever God hath said unto thee, do. This verse highlights a few important lessons. Recognition of God's providence. Rachel and Leah acknowledge that it was God who had blessed Jacob and caused the increase of their family's wealth. They attribute their prosperity to God's intervention and guidance. It serves as a reminder to us that all blessings and riches ultimately come from God. Trusting God's guidance, Rachel and Leah demonstrate their trust in God's leading by supporting Jacob's decision to leave Laban. They recognize that Jacob is following God's instructions and encourage him to do whatever God has commanded him to do. Their response reflects a willingness to submit to God's plans, even if it means leaving familiar surroundings and uncertain circumstances. Family unity. Rachel and Leah display solidarity with their husband, Jacob. Despite the difficulties they may have faced in their relationship with their father, they stand together as a family, recognizing their shared responsibility to follow God's guidance. This underscores the importance of unity within families and the support needed to navigate challenging situations. In summary, Genesis chapter 31 verse 16 provides insight into the faith and trust displayed by Rachel and Leah in God's providence and guidance. Their words encourage us to acknowledge God's blessings, trust His leading, and stand united with our family members in fulfilling His purposes. Genesis chapter 31 verse 17. Then Jacob rose up, and set his sons and his wives upon camels. Context. To understand the significance of Genesis chapter 31 verse 17, it's essential to consider the surrounding verses and the broader context of the book of Genesis. In this chapter, Jacob decides to leave Laban's household and return to his homeland, Canaan. Laban's sons had grown jealous of Jacob's prosperity, and Jacob received a message from God instructing him to go back to the land of his fathers. Genesis chapter 31 verse 3. Jacob's departure. In verse 17, we see Jacob's decisive action of preparing to leave Laban's house. He gathers his family, including his wives, Rachel and Leah, and his children, and sets them upon camels. This verse marks a significant turning point in Jacob's life as he prepares to leave the place where he had served Laban for many years. Symbolism of the camels. The mention of camels in this verse holds symbolic significance. Camels were valuable animals in ancient times, often used for transportation and trade. They were associated with wealth, provision, and journeying to distant lands. By placing his family on the camels, Jacob demonstrates his determination to leave Laban's household and embark on a journey toward God's promised land. Faith and obedience. Jacob's decision to leave Laban's house reflects his obedience to God's instruction. God had promised to bless Jacob and make his descendants into a great nation. Genesis chapter 28 verses 13 through 15. Despite the challenges and uncertainties, Jacob's faith in God's promises compelled him to take this step of faith and obey God's leading. Trusting in God's provision, Jacob's departure with his family and possessions demonstrates his trust in God's provision. He had experienced God's faithfulness throughout his time with Laban, where God blessed and prospered him. Now, as he sets out on this journey, he relies on God's continued guidance and provision to fulfill his promises. Application: Genesis chapter 31 verse 17 teaches us several valuable lessons. It reminds us of the importance of obedience to God's instructions, even when it involves leaving familiar and comfortable circumstances. Like Jacob, we need to trust in God's promises, relying on His provision as we step out in faith. It's crucial to recognize that God is faithful, and He will guide us on the journey of life if we place our trust in Him. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 31 verse 17 showcases Jacob's obedience to God's instruction as he prepares to leave Laban's household. It highlights his faith and trust in God's promises and serves as a reminder for us to trust in God's provision and follow His leading in our own lives. Genesis chapter 31 verse 18. And he carried away all his cattle, and all his goods which he had gotten, the cattle of his getting, which he had gotten in Padanaram, for to go to Isaac his father in the land of Canaan. Context: Genesis chapter 31 recounts the departure of Jacob and his family from Laban's household. Jacob had worked for Laban for 20 years, during which he acquired wealth through his diligent shepherding. However, Laban's sons began to envy Jacob, and God instructed Jacob to return to his homeland, Canaan. Symbolism of cattle and goods: in this verse, we see Jacob taking all his cattle and goods with him on his journey back to Canaan. The cattle and goods symbolize the material blessings and wealth that Jacob had acquired while living in Laban's house. It reflects God's faithfulness to Jacob, fulfilling the promise He made to bless him, Genesis chapter 28 verses 13 through 15. God's providence: throughout the narrative, we see God's providential care for Jacob. It was God who had prospered Jacob's work, causing his flock to increase abundantly. This reminds us that God is the source of all blessings and that He can bless us wherever we are, even in challenging circumstances. Obedience to God's calling: Jacob's journey back to Canaan demonstrates his obedience to God's command. Despite the difficulties he faced and the uncertainty of leaving his established life, he chose to follow God's leading. This serves as an example for us, encouraging obedience to God's call, even when it requires leaving our comfort zones. Faithfulness to family: Jacob's intention in returning to Canaan was to reunite with his father, Isaac. It reveals his commitment to his family and his responsibility as a son. Similarly, we are called to honor and care for our families, showing love, respect, and support. God's covenant promises: Jacob's return to Canaan is significant in the broader context of God's covenant promises to Abraham. By going back to the land that God had promised to his ancestors, Jacob participates in the fulfillment of those promises. This emphasizes God's faithfulness to His covenant and His faithfulness to His people. Application: from this verse, we can learn several valuable lessons. We should recognize and acknowledge that all our blessings come from God. We should obediently follow God's leading, even when it means leaving our comfort zones. We should prioritize and value our family relationships. And we should trust in God's faithfulness to fulfill His promises. Remember, studying the Bible involves exploring the larger context, considering historical and cultural backgrounds, and seeking guidance from trusted pastors and teachers. Genesis chapter 31 verse 19. And Laban went to shear his sheep, and Rachel had stolen the images that were her father's. Context and background: Genesis chapter 31 recounts the events surrounding Jacob's departure from his father-in-law Laban's house. Jacob had been working for Laban for 20 years and desired to return to his homeland with his wives and children. Laban's sons were growing envious of Jacob's prosperity, and Laban's attitude towards Jacob had changed. In this verse, we see Laban leaving to shear his sheep, while Rachel secretly steals her father's household idols. Laban's departure to shear his sheep. Laban, being a shepherd, went to shear his sheep. Sheep shearing was an important event in the life of a shepherd. It was a time to gather wool for trading, and it marked a significant moment in the economic cycle. Laban's focus on shearing his sheep provides the context for the events that follow. Rachel's theft. Rachel, Jacob's wife, steals her father's household idols. These images, or household gods, were likely small idols or objects associated with religious practices in Laban's household. It's important to note that these idols were considered false gods, and their presence in Laban's household suggests that he was involved in idolatry, contrary to the faith of Jacob's family. Possible motives for Rachel's theft. Rachel's motive for stealing the idols remains unclear from the immediate context. Some scholars speculate that she may have taken them to ensure her father's powerlessness to pursue them or as a symbol of her continued allegiance to her family. Others suggest that she may have believed in the power of these idols and sought to possess them for her own protection or benefit. Spiritual implications. Disapproval of idolatry. The presence of Laban's idols highlights the pervasive idolatry in the culture of the time. This verse reminds us of the importance of worshipping the one true God and not placing our faith in false gods or idols. Personal responsibility. Rachel's actions, though they may be influenced by her circumstances, serve as a reminder that we are each responsible for our choices and actions before God. We should strive to maintain integrity and follow God's ways, even when faced with challenges. Divine protection. As the story unfolds, it becomes evident that God protected Jacob and his family from Laban's pursuit. Rachel's theft of the idols may have played a part in God's intervention and guidance throughout this journey, ensuring the fulfillment of his promises to Jacob. Lessons for today. Trust in God's provision. The story reminds us to trust in God's provision and guidance in our lives. Jacob and his family faced uncertainties, but God was faithful to protect and guide them. We should place our trust in God and seek His will in all circumstances. Rejection of false gods. The presence of idols in Laban's household serves as a reminder to reject any form of idolatry in our lives. We must worship God alone and not place our trust in material possessions, worldly pursuits, or any false ideologies that take precedence over our relationship with Him. Personal integrity. Rachel's actions also prompt us to consider our own integrity. We should strive to live upright lives, making choices that honor God and align with His commandments, even in challenging situations. Remember, when studying the Bible, it is helpful to consider the context, historical background, and the broader themes and messages conveyed throughout Scripture. Genesis chapter 31 verse 20. And Jacob stole away unawares to Laban the Syrian, in that he told him not that he fled. Context. Genesis chapter 31 recounts the story of Jacob's departure from his father-in-law Laban's household. Jacob had worked for Laban for 20 years, marrying Laban's daughters Leah and Rachel and fathering many children. However, Laban's attitude towards Jacob had become increasingly hostile, and God had instructed Jacob to return to his homeland, Canaan. Explanation and lessons. Jacob's departure. The verse states that Jacob stole away unawares to Laban. Jacob chose to leave Laban's household secretly, without informing him beforehand. Jacob's decision to flee was driven by the growing tension between him and Laban, as well as the divine call to return to Canaan. This action may raise ethical questions, but it is important to consider the circumstances and Jacob's motivation. Trust in God's guidance. Jacob's decision to leave Laban was not merely based on his personal desires or grievances. He had received a clear instruction from God to return to Canaan, Genesis chapter 31 verse 3. This demonstrates Jacob's reliance on God's guidance and his obedience to divine instruction. The passage reminds us of the importance of seeking God's will and trusting in His direction, even in difficult situations. God's providence and protection. Jacob's flight from Laban was not without risks. Laban pursued Jacob, but God intervened and warned Laban in a dream, instructing him not to harm Jacob, Genesis chapter 31 verse 24. Through this incident, we see God's providential care and protection over Jacob. It is a reminder that when we follow God's leading, He watches over us and shields us from harm. Honesty and transparency. Although Jacob chose to leave secretly, it is important to note that honesty and transparency are essential values in our relationships. Jacob's actions may have been justified given the circumstances, but it is generally best to maintain open communication and resolve conflicts through dialogue rather than resorting to secrecy or deception. Consequences of deception. Jacob's relationship with Laban had been marked by deception on both sides. Laban had deceived Jacob multiple times, such as giving him Leah instead of Rachel as his wife. Jacob had also deceived Laban by selectively breeding the flock to increase his own wealth. Genesis chapter 30 verse 37 through 43. While Jacob's departure was justified, it serves as a reminder of the consequences of deception and the importance of pursuing righteousness and integrity in our actions. Overall, Genesis chapter 31 verse 20 highlights Jacob's departure from Laban's household and the circumstances surrounding it. It emphasizes Jacob's trust in God's guidance, God's providential care, and the importance of honesty and transparency in relationships. Genesis chapter 31 verse 21. So he fled with all that he had, and he rose up, and passed over the river, and set his face toward the Mount Gilead. Context: Genesis chapter 31 records the events surrounding Jacob's departure from Laban's household. Jacob had served Laban for 20 years and had acquired wealth and a large family during this time. However, Laban's sons became jealous, and Laban himself began to show signs of hostility towards Jacob. Consequently, God instructed Jacob to return to his homeland, Canaan. Flight from Laban. In verse 21, we see that Jacob decided to flee from Laban's presence. He took his possessions, including his family and livestock, and embarked on a journey towards Mount Gilead, a mountainous region east of the Jordan River. This action was motivated by Jacob's desire to protect his family and to follow God's leading to return to his ancestral land. Trusting God's guidance, Jacob's decision to leave Laban's household and set his face towards Mount Gilead demonstrates his faith and obedience to God. Throughout his life, Jacob had experienced numerous challenges and trials, but he recognized God's hand in his life. He trusted that God would guide him and protect him in this journey as well. Symbolism of the river. The phrase, "passed over the river," in the verse has some symbolic significance. Crossing a river often represents transition, leaving behind one phase of life and entering into a new one. In Jacob's case, crossing the river may symbolize his departure from Laban's influence and his transition back to the Promised Land. It also signifies a new chapter in his life and his journey towards fulfilling God's promises. Lessons for us. This verse teaches us several valuable lessons. First, it reminds us of the importance of trusting God's guidance in our lives. Like Jacob, we may face uncertain circumstances or difficult decisions, but we can have confidence that God is with us and will lead us in the right direction. Second, it emphasizes the significance of obedience to God's instructions. Jacob's willingness to obey God's call despite the challenges and risks involved serves as an example for us to follow. Finally, the verse encourages us to embrace transitions in life, knowing that God can use them to fulfill His purposes and lead us to a better place. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 31 verse 21 highlights Jacob's decision to leave Laban's household, cross the river, and set his face towards Mount Gilead. It demonstrates his faith in God's guidance and his obedience to God's call. This verse serves as a reminder for us to trust God, obey His commands, and embrace the transitions in our lives, knowing that He is with us every step of the way. Genesis chapter 31 verse 22. And it was told Laban on the third day that Jacob was fled. Context: Genesis chapter 31 narrates the story of Jacob's departure from his father-in-law Laban's house. After working for Laban for many years, Jacob decides to return to his homeland with his wives, children, and possessions. Laban becomes aware of Jacob's departure on the third day after he leaves. Jacob's decision to leave. Before this verse, Jacob had endured mistreatment and unfairness from Laban. God had blessed Jacob with abundant livestock, and Laban's sons became envious. Jacob perceived that Laban's attitude had turned against him, so he decided to return to his father Isaac's household in Canaan. Laban's reaction. Upon hearing that Jacob had fled, Laban's response becomes the focal point of the subsequent events. He gathers his relatives and pursues Jacob, eventually catching up with him. Symbolism and spiritual lessons. Jacob's departure represents a significant turning point in his life. He had fulfilled his obligations to Laban and recognized that God was leading him back to his own land. This episode teaches us the importance of recognizing God's guidance and responding to it. Laban's pursuit reveals the consequences of mistreatment and deception. Laban had dealt deceitfully with Jacob, changing his wages multiple times. The pursuit signifies the potential repercussions of our actions, as Laban had sown seeds of discontent and mistrust through his mistreatment of Jacob. God's faithfulness and protection. Despite the challenges and dangers Jacob faced during his journey, God intervened to protect him. In the subsequent verses, God warns Laban in a dream not to harm Jacob, preserving Jacob and his family. This reminds us of God's promise to be with us and protect us in our journeys, even when we face opposition or difficult circumstances. Application. Trusting in God's guidance. Like Jacob, we should seek God's direction in our lives. When faced with important decisions, it is crucial to align our plans with God's will and trust in His guidance. Integrity in our dealings. Laban's actions serve as a cautionary tale about the consequences of mistreating others. We should strive to treat people fairly and honestly, recognizing the value of integrity in our relationships. Reliance on God's protection. Jacob's story reminds us that God is our protector and provider. Even in challenging situations, we can find comfort in knowing that God is watching over us and will guide us through difficult circumstances. Genesis chapter 31 verse 22 highlights Jacob's departure from Laban's house and Laban's subsequent pursuit. This account teaches us about recognizing God's guidance, the consequences of mistreatment, and God's faithfulness in protecting His people. Genesis chapter 31 verse 23. Then he took his brethren with him, and pursued after him 7 days' journey, and they overtook him in the Mount Gilead. Context. In Genesis chapter 31, we find Jacob leaving Laban's house with his wives, children, and possessions. Laban pursued Jacob, suspecting that he had fled with his daughters and livestock. In this verse, we see that Laban, along with his kinsmen, referred to as his brethren, pursued Jacob for 7 days until they caught up with him in the mountains of Gilead. Jacob's journey. After spending many years working for Laban and facing mistreatment, Jacob received a message from God instructing him to return to his homeland. Genesis chapter 31 verse 3. Jacob decided to leave secretly, taking his wives Rachel and Leah, his children, and all his acquired wealth. However, Laban discovered Jacob's departure and pursued him. Mount Gilead. The pursuit of Laban led him to the mountains of Gilead, a region situated east of the Jordan River, in present-day Jordan. This area held significant historical and biblical significance. The name Gilead means rocky region or witness heap. In the Old Testament, Gilead was known for its fertile land and as a place of refuge. Symbolism and lessons. Divine protection. Throughout Jacob's journey, God's hand of protection is evident. Despite the pursuit, Laban did not harm Jacob. This event highlights God's faithfulness in guiding and safeguarding His people, even in challenging situations. God's promises. Jacob's departure from Laban was part of God's plan to fulfill His promise to make Jacob into a great nation. Genesis chapter 28 verses 13 through 15. The events unfolding in this chapter illustrate God's faithfulness in fulfilling His promises, as He had previously assured Jacob that He would be with him wherever he went. Genesis chapter 31 verse 3. Justice and restoration. Laban's pursuit reveals his desire to regain what he believed belonged to him. Jacob had endured years of mistreatment, and this confrontation provides an opportunity for justice and restoration. It serves as a reminder that God is the ultimate judge, and he ensures justice and restoration in his perfect timing. Geographic significance. The mention of the mountains of Gilead adds a geographical layer to the story. It reminds readers of the land's significance in biblical narratives and its role as a place of refuge and protection. The setting contributes to the overall context and significance of the encounter between Jacob and Laban. Genesis chapter 31 verse 23 presents an important episode in the life of Jacob, showcasing God's faithfulness, his protection, and the fulfillment of his promises. It also emphasizes the role of justice, restoration, and the geographical significance of Gilead. Studying this verse helps us understand God's involvement in the lives of his people and reminds us of his promises and provision. Genesis chapter 31 verse 24. And God came to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night, and said unto him, Take heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. This verse is part of the larger narrative in Genesis that recounts the events surrounding Jacob's departure from Laban's household. To fully understand the significance of Genesis chapter 31 verse 24, it is helpful to provide some context. Jacob had been living and working for his uncle Laban for 20 years. During this time, Laban had deceived Jacob multiple times, changing his wages and attempting to manipulate him. Jacob, recognizing that God had blessed him and desired to return to his homeland, decided to leave Laban's household with his family and flocks. Before Jacob's departure, Laban was informed of his plan. In response, Laban pursued Jacob with the intention of confronting him. However, God intervened by appearing to Laban in a dream, cautioning him not to say anything good or bad to Jacob. This encounter reveals several important aspects. God's intervention. The verse highlights God's direct involvement in the lives of his people. In this instance, God took the initiative to speak to Laban, ensuring that Jacob would be protected during his journey. Divine guidance. God's message to Laban serves as a reminder that his plans and purposes supersede human intentions. Laban might have intended to harm or deceive Jacob, but God's intervention prevented him from doing so. Protection of his chosen. God's instructions to Laban indicate his care for Jacob and his family. By warning Laban not to speak either good or bad to Jacob, God ensured that no harm would come to Jacob during his departure. Fulfillment of God's promises. Throughout the book of Genesis, God made promises to Jacob regarding his descendants and the land that would belong to them. Jacob's departure from Laban's household was a necessary step in the fulfillment of those promises, and God's intervention ensured that Jacob could leave Laban and continue on his journey without hindrance. Genesis chapter 31 verse 24 reminds believers of God's faithfulness and his active involvement in their lives. It demonstrates that even in challenging situations, God can protect, guide, and fulfill his purposes. As we reflect on this verse, we are encouraged to trust in God's provision and guidance, knowing that he is with us every step of the way. Genesis chapter 31 verse 25. Then Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the mount, and Laban with his brethren pitched in the mount of Gilead. This verse is part of the larger narrative of Jacob's departure from Laban's household. To fully understand the significance of Genesis chapter 31 verse 25, it's helpful to provide some context. Jacob had been working for his uncle Laban for many years, primarily tending to Laban's flocks. Over time, Jacob had become prosperous, acquiring a large number of livestock. However, Laban's sons became envious of Jacob's success, and Laban himself also began to treat Jacob less favorably. In Genesis chapter 31, God speaks to Jacob, instructing him to return to his homeland, the land of Canaan. Jacob shares God's message with his wives, Rachel and Leah, and tells them of his desire to leave Laban's household. Rachel and Leah affirm their support and express their dissatisfaction with their father, Laban. Verse 25 occurs when Laban learns of Jacob's departure. Laban gathers his relatives and pursues Jacob, overtaking him. The verse mentions that Jacob had pitched his tent in the mount, and Laban and his brethren also pitched their tents in the Mount of Gilead. This encounter between Laban and Jacob sets the stage for the ensuing confrontation and dialogue between them, which spans several verses. Ultimately, Laban and Jacob come to an agreement and establish a covenant, marking a resolution to their conflict. While Genesis chapter 31 verse 25 itself doesn't contain explicit theological teachings, it serves as a pivotal moment in the story of Jacob's departure from Laban's household. It highlights the tension and confrontation that precede the resolution between Jacob and Laban. From a broader perspective, this passage emphasizes the themes of God's providence, protection, and guidance in the lives of his people. It shows how God directed Jacob to leave Laban and return to the land of Canaan, and despite the potential for conflict and adversity, God ensured Jacob's safety and ultimately resolved the situation in a peaceful manner. As with any verse in the Bible, it is valuable to consider the surrounding context, the overall narrative, and the broader themes of Scripture when seeking a deeper understanding and application of the passage. Genesis chapter 31 verse 26. And Laban said to Jacob, What hast thou done, that thou hast stolen away unawares to me, and carried away my daughters, as captives taken with the sword? This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis that describes Jacob's departure from Laban's household. To understand the context of this verse, let's explore the preceding events. In Genesis chapter 31, we learn that Jacob had been living and working for his father-in-law, Laban, for a significant period of time. During this time, Jacob married Laban's daughters, Leah and Rachel, and had accumulated substantial wealth in terms of livestock. However, Jacob's relationship with Laban had become strained due to Laban's deceitful behavior towards him. In verse 20, we see that Jacob decided to leave Laban's house secretly, taking his wives and children along with him. He did so because Laban had changed his wages multiple times and had not dealt with him fairly. Jacob felt it was time to return to his homeland, Canaan. In verse 26, Laban confronts Jacob about his departure. Laban accuses Jacob of stealing away unawares, meaning that Jacob had left without giving Laban any notice or bidding farewell. Laban also claims that Jacob has taken away his daughters as captives, comparing their departure to the spoils of war taken by a conquering army. It is important to note that Laban's accusations are not true. Jacob did not steal Laban's daughters. Rather, he took his wives and children with him as they were his family. Laban's accusations reveal his selfishness and desire to control and manipulate Jacob. This verse highlights the tense relationship between Jacob and Laban. Laban's accusation reflects his resentment towards Jacob for leaving and taking what he perceived as his property. However, it also demonstrates Jacob's determination to break free from Laban's oppressive and unfair treatment. From a broader perspective, this passage highlights the themes of family, loyalty, and the consequences of deceit. Laban's deceptive actions towards Jacob ultimately lead to strained relationships and a breakdown of trust. Jacob's decision to leave was driven by his desire to protect his family and seek a better future, even though it meant facing Laban's anger. In summary, Genesis chapter 31 verse 26 presents Laban's accusation against Jacob for leaving without notice and taking his daughters with him. It serves as a pivotal moment in the narrative, showcasing the strained relationship between the two men and Jacob's resolve to break free from Laban's control. Genesis chapter 31 verse 27. Wherefore didst thou flee away secretly, and steal away from me, and didst not tell me, that I might have sent thee away with mirth, and with songs, with tabret, and with harp? This verse is part of the narrative in the book of Genesis that describes the events surrounding Jacob's departure from Laban's household. Jacob had worked for Laban for many years, marrying his daughters Leah and Rachel and building up his own wealth in the process. However, Laban's sons began to feel jealous of Jacob's success, and Laban himself became less favorable towards him. In this particular verse, Laban questions Jacob about his decision to flee secretly without informing him. Laban expresses his disappointment and accuses Jacob of stealing away without giving him the opportunity to send him off with joyous celebrations, including mirth, songs, tabrets, that is tambourines, and harps. Laban seems to be hurt and offended by Jacob's actions. This verse highlights the strained relationship between Jacob and Laban. Laban's question reveals his confusion as to why Jacob chose to leave secretly, instead of discussing his intentions openly. It also reveals Laban's desire for a more ceremonious departure, where he could bid farewell to Jacob in a celebratory manner. From a broader perspective, this verse reflects the complex dynamics within families and relationships. It portrays the consequences of mistrust and miscommunication, which can lead to feelings of betrayal and hurt. It serves as a reminder that open and honest communication is essential in maintaining healthy relationships and avoiding unnecessary conflicts. In the subsequent verses of Genesis chapter 31, Jacob responds to Laban, explaining his reasons for leaving secretly. Jacob describes how Laban had changed the terms of their agreement multiple times and how God had instructed him to return to his homeland. Through this, the narrative continues to unfold, shedding light on the tensions and events that shaped Jacob's journey. Genesis chapter 31 verse 28. And hast not suffered me to kiss my sons and my daughters. Thou hast now done foolishly in so doing. Context: this verse is part of the account of Jacob's departure from Laban's household. Jacob had worked for his father-in-law Laban for 20 years, tending to his flocks. However, Laban had repeatedly deceived Jacob and changed his wages. God had instructed Jacob to return to his homeland, and Jacob decided to leave secretly with his family and possessions. Betrayal and frustration. In this verse, Jacob confronts Laban and expresses his frustration and disappointment. Jacob reminds Laban that he had not been allowed to say goodbye properly to his sons and daughters by kissing them. Laban's actions in hindering Jacob from bidding farewell to his family was seen as foolish and unjust. Reflection on Jacob's journey. This verse reveals Jacob's emotions as he reflects on his journey. He had endured years of mistreatment and deceit from Laban, yet he had remained faithful and diligent in his work. Now, Jacob recognizes that Laban's latest actions are just another example of his foolishness and lack of integrity. Trust in God's guidance. Throughout this chapter, we see God's intervention and guidance in Jacob's life. God had instructed Jacob to leave Laban and return to his homeland, promising to be with him. In the face of Laban's deception, Jacob trusted in God's guidance and followed his command. This verse reflects Jacob's confidence in God's plan and his frustration with Laban's attempts to hinder it. Application: Jacob's experience with Laban can teach us several lessons. Firstly, it reminds us of the importance of integrity and honesty in our relationships. Laban's deceitful behavior caused pain and frustration, damaging the trust between them. Secondly, it highlights the significance of trusting in God's guidance and following his instructions, even in challenging situations. Jacob's faithfulness to God's command led him on a journey of blessings and fulfillment of God's promises. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 31 verse 28 portrays Jacob's frustration and disappointment with Laban's foolish actions, denying him the opportunity to bid farewell to his family properly. This verse emphasizes the importance of integrity in relationships and highlights the significance of trusting in God's guidance, even when faced with deceit and obstacles. Genesis chapter 31 verse 29. It is in the power of my hand to do you hurt, but the God of your father spake unto me yesternight, saying, Take thou heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. This verse is a part of the account of Jacob's departure from Laban's house. Jacob had worked for Laban for many years, and now he desired to return to his homeland with his wives, children, and possessions. However, Laban was reluctant to let him go. This verse contains Laban's words to Jacob as he confronts him. In this statement, Laban acknowledges that he has the ability to harm Jacob. He claims to have the power to cause him trouble or injury. However, Laban also reveals that God had spoken to him in a dream the previous night, instructing him not to speak to Jacob either good or bad. This means that Laban was not to bless or curse Jacob, but to let him go peacefully. Laban's words reflect a recognition of God's authority and power. Despite his desire to harm Jacob, he acknowledges the divine intervention and the command he received in his dream. This serves as a reminder that God's plans and purposes are at work even in the midst of human conflicts and intentions. Laban's acknowledgement of the God of Jacob's father indicates a recognition of the God of Abraham and Isaac, who had blessed Jacob. It reveals that Laban understood that Jacob's God was a powerful deity who had spoken directly to him. This recognition possibly influenced Laban's decision to allow Jacob to leave peacefully, as he feared the consequences of going against God's command. This verse highlights the sovereignty of God and his ability to intervene in human affairs. It also demonstrates the significance of dreams as a means through which God communicates his will. Laban's words indicate a mixture of fear, acknowledgement, and submission to God's authority. Overall, Genesis chapter 31 verse 29 shows us how God's involvement can influence human decisions, even in circumstances where conflict or harm may be intended. It reminds us of the importance of recognizing God's power and submitting to his guidance, as Laban ultimately chose to do in this situation. Genesis chapter 31 verse 30. And now, though thou wouldest needs be gone, because thou sore longest after thy father's house, yet wherefore hast thou stolen my gods? Context: this verse is part of the story of Jacob's departure from Laban's household. Jacob had worked for Laban for 20 years, marrying his daughters Leah and Rachel and accumulating wealth. However, Jacob felt mistreated by Laban and decided to return to his own land. Before leaving, Jacob and his family secretly left Laban's household, taking their possessions and setting out towards Canaan. When Laban discovered their departure, he pursued Jacob and caught up with him. This verse is spoken by Laban to Jacob, questioning why he had stolen Laban's household idols or gods. Key points to consider: Jacob's desire to leave. Laban acknowledges that Jacob was determined to leave and return to his father Isaac's house. Jacob had been away for many years and likely longed to reunite with his family. The accusation of theft. Laban accuses Jacob of stealing his household gods. These idols were objects of worship in Laban's household, and Laban was deeply attached to them. It's worth noting that Jacob was not aware that Rachel had taken the idols. Genesis chapter 31 verse 32. Laban's accusation leads to a search of Jacob's camp. The significance of the idols. Laban's mention of the idols reveals his attachment to them and his perception of their importance. It also highlights the prevalent idolatrous practices in that region at the time. Jacob's departure signifies a turning point in his family's journey towards serving the one true God, as they were distancing themselves from Laban's pagan customs. Jacob's commitment to monotheism. Jacob's response to Laban's accusation reflects his strong commitment to monotheism. In Genesis chapter 31 verse 32, Jacob declares that anyone found with the idols should not live, emphasizing that his household serves the true God alone. This statement indicates that Jacob had developed a deeper understanding and faith in God during his time with Laban. Lessons we can learn. Faithfulness to God. Jacob's refusal to tolerate idolatry demonstrates his devotion to the Lord. As believers, we should also strive to remain faithful to God and not compromise our beliefs, even in challenging circumstances. God's guidance. Jacob's departure from Laban's house was part of God's plan to fulfill his promises to Jacob. It serves as a reminder that when we follow God's leading, he guides and protects us, even in the face of adversity. Repudiation of false gods. Jacob's separation from Laban's idols symbolizes his rejection of false gods and his commitment to serve the one true God. We are called to turn away from anything that competes with or replaces God in our lives and worship Him alone. Transformation through faith. Jacob's time with Laban was transformative, as he grew in his understanding and trust in God. Our own journeys of faith may involve challenges and trials, but they can also be opportunities for growth and maturation in our relationship with God. In summary, Genesis chapter 31 verse 30 highlights Laban's accusation against Jacob for taking his household idols. It reveals Jacob's desire to leave Laban's household, the idolatrous practices prevalent at that time, and Jacob's commitment to monotheism. The verse serves as a reminder of the importance of faithfulness to God, His guidance in our lives, the rejection of false gods, and the transformative power of faith. Genesis chapter 31 verse 31. And Jacob answered and said to Laban, Because I was afraid, for I said, Peradventure thou wouldest take by force thy daughters from me. This verse is a part of the narrative in the book of Genesis that describes Jacob's departure from Laban's house. Jacob had been working for Laban for many years, tending his flocks, and had acquired wives and children during that time. In this particular verse, Laban confronts Jacob regarding his sudden departure and accuses him of deceitfully taking his daughters and grandchildren away. Jacob responds to Laban, explaining the reason for his actions. He confesses that he left secretly because he was afraid that Laban would forcefully take his daughters away from him. This verse highlights the tense relationship between Jacob and Laban, which had been strained for some time. Laban had continually changed Jacob's wages and treated him unfairly. Jacob had also witnessed God's intervention and blessing in his life, which motivated him to leave Laban and return to his homeland. Jacob's response in this verse reveals his concerns and fears about Laban's intentions. He felt that Laban could try to exert his authority and take his daughters away from him, separating him from his family. Jacob's decision to leave secretly reflects his desire to protect his loved ones and fulfill God's calling to return to his own country. From a broader perspective, this passage demonstrates the complexity of human relationships and the difficulties faced when conflicts arise. It also illustrates the importance of trust and open communication within family dynamics. Jacob's fear of Laban's potential actions highlights the need for discernment and reliance on God's guidance in challenging situations. Overall, Genesis chapter 31 verse 31 provides insight into Jacob's motivation for leaving Laban's house and emphasizes the significance of family, trust, and the pursuit of God's will in our lives. Genesis chapter 31 verse 32. With whomsoever thou findest thy gods, let him not lie. Before our brethren discern thou what is thine with me, and take it to thee. For Jacob knew not that Rachel had stolen them. In this verse, we find Jacob speaking to his father-in-law Laban. To understand the context of this verse, we need to explore the events leading up to it. Jacob had been working for Laban for many years, primarily because he desired to marry Laban's younger daughter, Rachel. However, Laban had deceived Jacob by giving him Leah, Rachel's older sister, in marriage before allowing him to marry Rachel. Jacob eventually married Rachel as well, but his relationship with Laban had become strained. In Genesis chapter 31, we read about Jacob's departure from Laban's household. Jacob decided to leave Laban's service because he felt Laban had dealt unfairly with him. Moreover, God had instructed Jacob to return to his own land. Jacob gathered his wives, children, and livestock and embarked on his journey back to Canaan. Before leaving, Rachel, unbeknownst to Jacob, had stolen Laban's household idols. Laban soon realized that Jacob had left and pursued him, catching up with him in the hill country of Gilead. In the midst of their confrontation, Jacob, unaware of Rachel's theft, makes a statement in Genesis chapter 31 verse 32. Jacob tells Laban that if anyone among them is found with Laban's gods, that person should not live. He advises Laban to search for his gods and discern what belongs to Laban, implying that he and his family have nothing to do with them. Jacob's statement is significant because it demonstrates his commitment to following the true God, whom he acknowledges as the only one worthy of worship and reverence. The verse also reveals that Jacob was unaware of Rachel's theft. This ignorance on Jacob's part underscores the fact that the idols Rachel had stolen did not hold any value or significance for Jacob or his family. It indicates that they had distanced themselves from any form of idolatry and were solely devoted to the worship of the one true God. It is important to note that the Bible consistently condemns idolatry and the worship of false gods. Jacob's declaration in Genesis chapter 31 verse 32 aligns with this biblical principle, as he expresses his disdain for idolatrous practices and his desire for the true God to be honored and worshipped. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 31 verse 32 highlights Jacob's commitment to monotheistic worship and his unknowingness of Rachel's theft. It serves as a reminder of the Bible's condemnation of idolatry and emphasizes the importance of remaining faithful to the one true God. Genesis chapter 31 verse 33. And Laban went into Jacob's tent, and into Leah's tent, and into the two maidservants' tents, but he found them not. Then went he out of Leah's tent, and entered into Rachel's tent. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis chapter 31 that describes Jacob's departure from his father-in-law Laban's house after serving him for many years. Jacob decided to leave because Laban and his sons had become envious of Jacob's increasing prosperity and blessings from God. In this particular verse, Laban, suspicious of Jacob's sudden departure, searches through Jacob's tents in an attempt to find something that he could use against him or accuse him of stealing. Laban first enters Jacob's tent, but he does not find anything of significance. Then he enters Leah's tent, the tent of Jacob's first wife, but again, he does not find anything. Laban continues his search and enters the tents of Jacob's two maidservants, but still, he finds nothing. Finally, Laban enters Rachel's tent, the tent of Jacob's beloved wife, as his last attempt to find any evidence. This verse highlights Laban's desperate attempt to locate any possessions that may have been taken without his knowledge or permission. Laban's actions reveal his distrust and suspicion toward Jacob, which had been building up over time. However, Laban's search proves futile, as he does not find anything incriminating or stolen. This incident underscores Jacob's innocence and integrity. Laban's unsuccessful search demonstrates that Jacob had not taken anything from Laban's household, further highlighting Jacob's faithfulness and honesty in his dealings with his father-in-law. It also emphasizes God's protection over Jacob, as Laban's search was unsuccessful due to divine intervention. From a broader perspective, this verse teaches us several valuable lessons. It reminds us of the importance of integrity and honesty in our relationships and dealings with others. Jacob serves as an example of how to conduct ourselves with integrity even in difficult circumstances. Additionally, this verse emphasizes God's faithfulness in protecting his people. Despite Laban's suspicion and attempts to harm Jacob, God was watching over Jacob and ensured that he remained blameless in this situation. It serves as a reminder that when we walk in obedience to God and seek to do what is right, He is faithful to protect and guide us. In summary, Genesis chapter 31 verse 33 portrays Laban's unsuccessful search through Jacob's tents, highlighting Jacob's integrity and God's faithfulness. This verse provides important lessons about maintaining honesty, even in challenging situations, and trusting in God's protection in our lives. Genesis chapter 31 verse 34. Now Rachel had taken the images, and put them in the camel's furniture, and sat upon them. And Laban searched all the tent, but found them not. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis that describes Jacob's departure from Laban's house after serving him for many years. In this particular verse, Rachel, Jacob's wife, takes her father Laban's household idols and conceals them in the camel's furniture. Laban, upon realizing that Jacob and his family have left, searches their tents in pursuit of the stolen idols but fails to find them. This verse raises several points for consideration and reflection. Idolatry and faithfulness. Laban's household idols, which were associated with pagan worship and false gods, were significant to him. However, Rachel's actions demonstrate her disregard for her father's idols and her allegiance to the God of Jacob. This event highlights the conflict between idolatry and the true worship of the one true God. Consequences of deception. Prior to this incident, Jacob and Rachel had deceived Laban by fleeing without informing him. Rachel's act of taking the idols and hiding them could be seen as an attempt to protect her family and prevent her father from accusing him of theft. While her intentions may have been well-meaning, deception and dishonesty often lead to further complications and difficulties in relationships. God's protection and sovereignty. Despite the deceit and turmoil surrounding Jacob's departure, God's providence is evident. Laban's search for the idols proves fruitless, as Rachel manages to hide them effectively. This situation underscores God's ability to protect His people and work through the circumstances to fulfill His purposes. Repudiation of false gods. Rachel's action of taking the idols and Jacob's subsequent separation from Laban mark a turning point in the family's spiritual journey. By leaving behind Laban's household and idols, Jacob and his family distance themselves from idolatrous practices and reaffirm their commitment to the worship of the true God. Ethical considerations. It is important to note that while the Bible records Rachel's actions, it does not necessarily endorse or condone them. The Bible portrays the characters in their humanity, with their flaws and strengths. Rachel's actions should not be taken as a model for behavior but rather as part of the historical account. In studying this verse, we can reflect on the themes of faithfulness to God, the consequences of deception, God's protection, the repudiation of false gods, and the importance of ethical behavior. As we engage with the Bible, it is crucial to interpret each passage within its broader context, seeking to understand the message it conveys and considering how it aligns with the overall teachings of Scripture. Genesis chapter 31 verse 35. And she said to her father, Let it not displease my lord that I cannot rise up before thee, for the custom of women is upon me. And he searched, but found not the images. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis chapter 31, which recounts the story of Jacob's departure from his father-in-law Laban's household. Laban pursued Jacob and accused him of stealing his household idols. Jacob, unaware that his wife Rachel had taken the idols, defended himself, asserting his innocence. Ultimately, Rachel, feeling the need to protect her secret, used the excuse of her menstrual cycle to prevent her father from searching her belongings thoroughly. This verse touches upon a few themes worth exploring. Cultural customs and respect. Rachel addresses her father Laban as "my lord," and asks him not to be displeased with her inability to rise before him. Rising before someone was a sign of respect and honor in ancient Middle Eastern cultures. Rachel's explanation of being on her menstrual cycle is a way of justifying her action and ensuring her privacy. This verse reveals the importance of cultural customs and the dynamics of respect within the family structure. The secrecy of Rachel's actions. Rachel's admission that she cannot rise before her father due to her menstrual cycle is a cover-up for her theft of Laban's idols. By using this excuse, she manages to deflect suspicion and protect her secret. This highlights the human inclination to hide our wrongdoings and the lengths people may go to preserve their reputations or avoid facing consequences. Laban's unsuccessful search for the idols. Laban, unaware of Rachel's deception, proceeds to search for the idols but does not find them. This adds tension to the narrative and builds suspense as the reader wonders if Laban will discover the truth. Laban's unsuccessful search emphasizes the irony of the situation and further highlights Rachel's cleverness in concealing her theft. This verse serves as a small but significant episode within the broader story of Jacob's relationship with Laban and his eventual departure from Laban's household. It provides insights into the cultural customs of the time, the dynamics between family members, and the lengths individuals may go to protect their interests. Genesis chapter 31 verse 36. And Jacob was wroth, and chode with Laban. And Jacob answered and said to Laban, What is my trespass? What is my sin, that thou hast so hotly pursued after me? In this verse, we witness a confrontation between Jacob and Laban, who were relatives by marriage. To fully understand the context of this verse, it is helpful to consider the events leading up to it. Jacob had been working for Laban, his uncle, for 20 years. During this time, Jacob experienced both blessings and challenges. Laban had initially deceived Jacob by giving him Leah, his elder daughter, in marriage instead of Rachel, whom Jacob loved. Eventually, Jacob also married Rachel, but their relationship remained strained due to Laban's manipulative actions. Over time, Jacob's flocks and wealth increased, which led to jealousy and resentment from Laban's sons. Moreover, God had spoken to Jacob, instructing him to return to his homeland, the land of Canaan. In response to God's command, Jacob decided to leave Laban's household and return to his family. However, Laban pursued Jacob and his family, likely with the intention of stopping them from leaving. This pursuit created tension and frustration between the two men, culminating in the confrontation described in Genesis chapter 31 verse 36. In this verse, we see Jacob's anger and his challenge to Laban. Jacob questions Laban, asking why he is so fervently pursuing him. Jacob wonders what wrongdoing or sin he has committed that would justify Laban's intense pursuit. This confrontation between Jacob and Laban raises several points of reflection. Firstly, it reminds us of the complexities of family relationships and the potential for conflict within them. Despite being relatives, Jacob and Laban experienced tension and strife due to their differing interests and motives. Secondly, this passage highlights Jacob's desire for justice and fairness. Jacob acknowledges that he is not aware of any transgression he has committed that justifies Laban's pursuit. This response shows Jacob's integrity and his willingness to confront Laban, seeking an explanation for his actions. Lastly, this verse serves as a reminder of God's faithfulness to Jacob. God had guided Jacob throughout his time with Laban, protecting him and multiplying his possessions. The pursuit by Laban did not deter God's plan for Jacob, as he had called Jacob to return to Canaan and fulfill the covenant promises made to his ancestors. In summary, Genesis chapter 31 verse 36 captures a pivotal moment in the relationship between Jacob and Laban. It emphasizes the complexities of family dynamics, Jacob's pursuit of justice, and God's faithfulness in fulfilling his promises. Genesis chapter 31 verse 37. Whereas thou hast searched all my stuff, what hast thou found of all thy household stuff? Set it here before my brethren and thy brethren, that they may judge betwixt us both. This verse is part of the narrative of Jacob's departure from Laban's household. To understand the context of Genesis chapter 31 verse 37, let's delve into the preceding events. In Genesis chapter 31, we find Jacob working for his father-in-law, Laban, tending his flock. Jacob had married Laban's daughters, Leah and Rachel, and over time, he had acquired a substantial number of sheep and goats. However, Jacob noticed that Laban and his sons had become envious of his prosperity. God then instructed Jacob to return to his homeland, the land of Canaan. Feeling that Laban's attitude had changed towards him, Jacob decided to leave secretly, taking his wives, children, and livestock with him. Rachel, unbeknownst to Jacob, took Laban's household idols. When Laban discovered Jacob's departure, he pursued him and caught up with him in the mountains of Gilead. Now we come to Genesis chapter 31 verse 37, where Jacob questions Laban about his actions. Jacob challenges Laban to search through all his belongings and see if he finds anything that belongs to him among Jacob's possessions. This statement was an invitation to Laban to prove his accusation that Jacob had stolen something from him. It is important to note that Jacob was unaware that Rachel had taken Laban's idols, which was a grave offense according to the customs of the time. Laban and Jacob's relationship had become strained over the years, and Laban suspected that Jacob had stolen his idols as a way of severing ties completely. However, Jacob's challenge indicates his innocence and his willingness to have the matter settled fairly by involving their respective relatives as judges. This verse highlights Jacob's integrity and desire for justice. He willingly allows Laban and the others to search through his possessions, confident that they will not find anything that belongs to Laban. Jacob's offer to have the judgment made before their brethren implies his commitment to transparency and his trust in the judgment of others to ascertain the truth. The broader theme we can draw from this episode in Jacob's life is the importance of integrity and honesty. Even when falsely accused, Jacob sought to resolve the conflict justly and was willing to face the judgment of others. This serves as a reminder for us to always strive for truth and fairness in our dealings with others. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 31 verse 37 captures Jacob's response to Laban's accusation. Jacob invites Laban to search his possessions and presents the opportunity for their brethren to act as judges, demonstrating his innocence and commitment to justice. This verse provides us with valuable lessons on integrity and the pursuit of fairness in our relationships. Genesis chapter 31 verse 38. This 20 years have I been with thee. Thy ewes and thy she-goats have not cast the young, and the rams of thy flock have I not eaten. In this verse, we find Jacob speaking to his father-in-law, Laban, in response to Laban's accusations. Let's provide some context to better understand the significance of this verse. Jacob had been working for Laban for a total of 20 years. Initially, Jacob had agreed to work for Laban for 7 years to marry Rachel, Laban's younger daughter. However, Laban deceived Jacob by giving him Leah, Rachel's older sister, in marriage. Jacob then agreed to work an additional 7 years for Rachel. During this time, Jacob experienced various challenges and conflicts with Laban. Laban changed Jacob's wages multiple times, attempting to benefit himself at Jacob's expense. Despite Laban's dishonesty and mistreatment, Jacob's hard work and faithfulness led to the growth of Laban's flocks and herds. Jacob tended to the animals, ensuring their well-being and protecting them from harm. In Genesis chapter 31 verse 38, Jacob defends his integrity and recounts the years he spent with Laban. He declares that during his time of service, none of Laban's sheep or goats had miscarriages or lost their young ones. Furthermore, Jacob claims that he never consumed any of the rams from Laban's flock for his own gain. This statement by Jacob highlights his commitment and dedication to his work. It shows that he acted with honesty and integrity despite Laban's unfair treatment. Jacob's care for the animals entrusted to him demonstrates his faithfulness in carrying out his responsibilities. This verse also serves as a reminder of God's presence and blessing upon Jacob. Throughout the narrative of Jacob's life, we see God's faithfulness in guiding and protecting him. Despite the difficulties he faced, Jacob acknowledged God as the source of his success and recognized that it was God who ensured the well-being of Laban's flocks. In summary, Genesis chapter 31 verse 38 showcases Jacob's faithfulness and honesty during his time of service to Laban. It reveals his commitment to his responsibilities and his acknowledgement of God's provision and blessing. This verse serves as a reminder to us of the importance of integrity and trustworthiness in our own dealings, even in challenging circumstances. Genesis chapter 31 verse 39. That which was torn of beasts I brought not unto thee. I bear the loss of it. Of my hand didst thou require it, whether stolen by day, or stolen by night. This verse is part of a dialogue between Jacob and his father-in-law Laban. To fully understand its significance, let's examine the context of this passage and explore its key themes and lessons. Context: in Genesis chapter 31, we find Jacob fleeing from Laban's household with his wives, children, and possessions. Jacob's departure is motivated by several factors, including Laban's mistreatment, jealousy, and an angelic message from God instructing Jacob to return to his homeland. Genesis chapter 31 verses 1 through 3. Prior to Jacob's escape, Laban had repeatedly changed Jacob's wages and attempted to manipulate him. Jacob explains to his wives, Rachel and Leah, how he had faithfully served Laban for 20 years, enduring harsh conditions, extreme weather, and the loss of his sleep while tending Laban's flocks. Genesis chapter 31 verses 38 through 40. Verse analysis: That which was torn of beasts I brought not unto thee. I bear the loss of it. In this part of the verse, Jacob explains that whenever an animal was killed by a wild beast, he did not bring it to Laban, indicating that he personally bore the financial loss resulting from such incidents. Despite the hardships and challenges, Jacob remained honest and took personal responsibility for his actions. Of my hand didst thou require it, whether stolen by day, or stolen by night. Here, Jacob acknowledges that if any animal was stolen from the flock, Laban would hold him accountable and demand reimbursement. Whether the theft occurred during the day or at night, Laban expected Jacob to compensate for the loss. Jacob emphasizes his dedication and commitment, highlighting the injustices he endured throughout his years of service. Key themes and lessons: responsibility and integrity. Jacob exemplifies personal responsibility and integrity by assuming the financial burden of lost or stolen livestock. He didn't shirk his responsibilities or pass the blame onto others, even when he had a valid reason for doing so. Faithfulness despite adversity. Despite Laban's mistreatment and constant changes in Jacob's wages, Jacob remained faithful to his obligations. He continued to work diligently and honorably, fulfilling his duties with integrity and loyalty. Trust in God's provision. Jacob's steadfastness in the face of Laban's unfair treatment reveals his trust in God's provision. He recognized that God was with him and would take care of him, regardless of the circumstances. Setting an example, Jacob's commitment to honesty and responsibility set an example for his family, displaying integrity in his actions. As believers, we are called to exhibit similar qualities in our relationships and dealings with others. Application. The passage encourages us to uphold principles of responsibility, integrity, and faithfulness in our lives. We should take personal responsibility for our actions and not shy away from the consequences of our choices. Furthermore, even when faced with adversity or unfair treatment, we can trust in God's provision and remain faithful to our commitments. This verse also reminds us of the importance of setting a positive example for those around us. By exhibiting integrity and honesty, we can inspire others to follow suit and glorify God through our actions. In summary, Genesis chapter 31 verse 39 highlights Jacob's honesty, personal responsibility, and faithfulness despite the challenging circumstances he faced while serving Laban. It encourages us to embody similar qualities in our own lives and trust in God's provision. Genesis chapter 31 verse 40. Thus I was, in the day the drought consumed me, and the frost by night, and my sleep departed from mine eyes. This verse is part of the account of Jacob's life, specifically during his time working for his uncle Laban. In this passage, Jacob is reflecting on the hardships he endured while serving Laban. Let's delve deeper into the context and themes present in this verse. Jacob had agreed to work for Laban for a specified period in order to marry his daughters Rachel and Leah. However, Laban continuously changed the terms of Jacob's wages, attempting to deceive him. Despite the difficult circumstances, Jacob demonstrated resilience and resourcefulness in managing his flocks, even when adverse conditions arose. In Genesis chapter 31 verse 40, Jacob vividly describes the harsh conditions he faced during his service to Laban. He speaks of both extremes of weather, drought consuming him during the day and frost chilling him at night. These conditions made it challenging for him to maintain the well-being of the flocks and affected his own physical well-being. Jacob's statement about his sleep departing from his eyes conveys the intensity of his labor and the stress he experienced. The weight of his responsibilities, the uncertainties he faced, and the mistreatment he endured all contributed to his restlessness and sleeplessness. This verse reflects Jacob's honest account of the difficulties he faced while serving Laban. It demonstrates the realities of life, the struggles we encounter, and the toll they can take on us physically, emotionally, and mentally. However, it is essential to note that this verse is not merely a lamentation of Jacob's hardships. It also underscores his determination to persevere despite the challenging circumstances. Jacob's story in Genesis serves as a reminder of the faithfulness and providence of God in the midst of trials. Throughout his life, Jacob experienced both blessings and tribulations, yet God remained faithful to his promises and protected Jacob. Eventually, Jacob would leave Laban's house and return to the land that God had promised to give him and his descendants. This verse encourages us to acknowledge the difficulties we face in life and the toll they may take on us. It reminds us to be honest with ourselves and with God about our struggles. Furthermore, it emphasizes the importance of relying on God's strength and faithfulness during challenging times, trusting that He will sustain us and fulfill His promises. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 31 verse 40 offers a glimpse into the hardships Jacob endured while working for Laban. It highlights the difficulties he faced in maintaining his flocks and his own well-being due to extreme weather conditions. Jacob's honest reflection reminds us to be open about our struggles and to trust in God's faithfulness and provision, even in the midst of challenging circumstances. Genesis chapter 31 verse 41. Thus have I been 20 years in thy house. I served thee 14 years for thy 2 daughters, and 6 years for thy cattle, and thou hast changed my wages 10 times. In this verse, Jacob is speaking to his father-in-law, Laban, after they have come to an agreement regarding their mutual grievances. To understand the significance of this verse, it is helpful to provide some context. Jacob had been living with Laban, his uncle, for a significant period of time. Jacob had initially fled to Laban's house in Haran to escape his brother Esau, who intended to kill him. While staying with Laban, Jacob fell in love with Rachel, Laban's younger daughter, and expressed his desire to marry her. Laban agreed but deceived Jacob by giving him Leah, his older daughter, in marriage instead. Jacob was then required to work another 7 years in order to marry Rachel, the woman he truly loved. Genesis chapter 29 verses 18 through 30. In addition to the marriage arrangement, Jacob and Laban also made an agreement regarding Jacob's wages for tending Laban's flocks. Initially, Laban offered to pay Jacob with speckled and spotted sheep and goats from his flock. However, Laban continually changed the terms of the agreement, attempting to manipulate Jacob's compensation. Genesis chapter 30 verses 31 through 43. By the time we reach Genesis chapter 31 verse 41, Jacob reflects on his time with Laban, stating that he had served him for 20 years. Out of those 20 years, 14 were dedicated to obtaining Rachel and Leah as his wives, and the remaining 6 years were spent tending Laban's livestock. Jacob emphasizes the frequent changes in his wages, highlighting Laban's inconsistent and unfair treatment towards him. This verse conveys Jacob's frustration and reveals the difficult circumstances he faced during his time with Laban. This particular passage underscores themes such as perseverance, faithfulness, and the consequences of deceptive actions. Jacob's commitment to Laban's service for such an extended period demonstrates his perseverance and determination in fulfilling his obligations. Furthermore, it highlights the consequences of Laban's deceitful actions, as Jacob's wages were repeatedly altered. Overall, Genesis chapter 31 verse 41 portrays a significant moment in Jacob's story, shedding light on his experiences and the challenges he encountered while living with Laban. It serves as a reminder that even in difficult circumstances, remaining faithful and steadfast can ultimately lead to the fulfillment of God's promises. Genesis chapter 31 verse 42. Except the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac, had been with me, surely thou hadst sent me away now empty. God hath seen mine affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked thee yesternight. In this verse, we find Jacob speaking to his father-in-law Laban after they had a tense encounter. To understand the context, let's briefly review the background of the passage. Jacob had been working for Laban for 20 years, tending his flocks. Over time, Jacob's flocks had multiplied greatly, which stirred jealousy and ill will in Laban. Feeling mistreated and deceived by Laban, Jacob decided to return to his homeland with his family and possessions. Now, let's break down Genesis chapter 31 verse 42 and explore its key elements. Except the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had been with me. Here, Jacob acknowledges that his ability to prosper and succeed despite Laban's mistreatment was due to the presence and faithfulness of God. Jacob recognizes that the God of his forefathers, Abraham and Isaac, had remained faithful and had protected him throughout his time with Laban. "Surely thou hadst sent me away now empty." Jacob asserts that without God's intervention and providence, Laban would have sent him away empty-handed. Laban's mistreatment could have resulted in Jacob leaving with nothing. However, God's favor had ensured that Jacob's possessions and prosperity increased over the years. "God hath seen mine affliction and the labor of my hands, and rebuked thee yesternight." Jacob acknowledges that God had seen his affliction and hard work. Despite Laban's attempts to deceive him and change their agreements multiple times, God had been watching over Jacob. Furthermore, Jacob mentions that God had rebuked Laban the previous night, implying that God had intervened on Jacob's behalf. This verse highlights several important themes in the biblical narrative, such as God's faithfulness, protection, and intervention in the lives of his people. It emphasizes that even in difficult circumstances, God is present and can turn the situation around for his people's benefit. Additionally, we see the importance of acknowledging God's role in our lives. Jacob recognizes that his success and well-being were not solely the result of his own efforts or Laban's favor, but were ultimately due to God's presence and blessings. Overall, Genesis chapter 31 verse 42 reminds us of the importance of relying on God's faithfulness, even in challenging situations, and acknowledging his role as the source of our provision and protection. Genesis chapter 31 verse 43. And Laban answered and said unto Jacob, These daughters are my daughters, and these children are my children, and these cattle are my cattle, and all that thou sayest is mine. And what can I do this day unto these my daughters, or unto their children which they have borne? This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis that describes the departure of Jacob from his father-in-law Laban's household. Jacob had worked for Laban for many years, primarily to gain the right to marry Laban's daughters Rachel and Leah. However, Laban's treatment of Jacob had become increasingly unfavorable, leading Jacob to decide to leave with his family and possessions. In this particular verse, Laban responds to Jacob's departure by expressing his possessive claim over his daughters, grandchildren, and livestock. Laban asserts that everything Jacob sees belongs to him and questions what he can do to prevent Jacob from taking away his daughters and grandchildren. From a broader perspective, this verse reflects the tension and conflict that arose between Jacob and Laban. It highlights Laban's possessiveness and the sense of entitlement over his family and possessions. Laban's words reveal his reluctance to let Jacob go and the fact that he sees his daughters and grandchildren as his property. This passage also serves as a reminder of the challenges and trials faced by Jacob as he sought to establish his own household and fulfill God's promises to him. Despite the difficulties he encountered, Jacob remained faithful to God and ultimately prospered. By studying the context and the surrounding verses, one can gain a deeper understanding of the story and the lessons it conveys about human relationships, God's providence, and the importance of remaining steadfast in the face of adversity. Genesis chapter 31 verse 4. Now therefore come thou, let us make a covenant, I and thou, and let it be for a witness between me and thee. Context: Genesis chapter 31 recounts the story of Jacob's departure from his father-in-law Laban's house. Jacob had worked for Laban for many years, and he decided to leave with his wives, children, and possessions. Laban pursued Jacob, and after a confrontation between the two, they made a covenant to ensure peaceful relations between them. Key points: Covenant making. In ancient times, making a covenant was a solemn agreement or contract between two parties. It was a way to establish and maintain a relationship based on trust and mutual obligations. In this verse, Laban proposes making a covenant with Jacob, indicating a desire for peace and the establishment of a lasting agreement. Witness: the covenant between Laban and Jacob was intended to serve as a witness to their agreement. It would bear testimony to their commitment and serve as a reminder of their promises. In ancient times, Witnesses played a crucial role in legal and contractual matters, providing credibility and ensuring the agreement's integrity. Resolution and reconciliation. The events leading up to this verse were filled with tension and conflict between Jacob and Laban. However, they decided to put aside their differences and make a covenant to ensure peace between their families. It signifies a turning point in their relationship, emphasizing the importance of resolving conflicts and seeking reconciliation. Application. This verse teaches us the value of making peace and resolving conflicts through honest communication and mutual agreements. It encourages us to seek reconciliation and work towards peaceful relationships with others, even in difficult circumstances. Making covenants or agreements can help foster trust and maintain harmony in our relationships. Overall, Genesis chapter 31 verse 4 highlights the importance of making covenants as a means of establishing peace, resolving conflicts, and maintaining healthy relationships. It reminds us of the significance of seeking reconciliation and working towards mutual understanding in our interactions with others. Genesis chapter 31 verse 45. And Jacob took a stone, and set it up for a pillar. Context. To understand the significance of Genesis chapter 31 verse 45, let's first look at the context. This verse is part of the narrative of Jacob's departure from Laban, his father-in-law. Jacob had worked for Laban for many years, but due to Laban's mistreatment and Jacob's desire to return to his own land, Jacob decided to leave secretly with his family and possessions. Setting up a pillar. In this verse, we see Jacob taking a stone and setting it up as a pillar. This act holds symbolic and practical significance. Throughout the Bible, pillars are often used to mark significant events or locations. In this case, Jacob erects a pillar as a memorial marker to commemorate the agreement he made with Laban. Memorial marker. Jacob's decision to set up a pillar serves as a visible reminder of the agreement between him and Laban. The purpose was to ensure that both parties would remember and honor their agreement in the future. It was a common practice in ancient times to set up markers or stones to commemorate significant events or covenants. Witness and testimony. The pillar also acted as a witness and testimony to the agreement. It would serve as a reminder for Jacob, Laban, and their respective families that they had made a covenant with each other. If any disputes or conflicts were to arise in the future, they could refer to the pillar as evidence of their agreement. Symbol of God's presence. In some instances in the Bible, pillars are associated with encounters with God. For example, Jacob himself had previously encountered God at Bethel, where he had a dream of a ladder reaching to heaven, Genesis chapter 28 verses 10 through 22. By setting up a pillar here, Jacob may have also intended to acknowledge God's presence and guidance in his life. Lessons and applications. From Genesis chapter 31 verse 45, we can learn several lessons. First, it highlights the importance of memorializing significant events or agreements as a way to remember and honor them. Second, it teaches us to be accountable and keep our promises, just as Jacob and Laban did by setting up the pillar. Third, it reminds us to acknowledge God's presence and guidance in our lives, even in the midst of challenging circumstances. Overall, Genesis chapter 31 verse 45 showcases the practice of setting up a memorial marker or pillar to commemorate significant events or agreements. It serves as a reminder, witness, and testimony to the agreement made between Jacob and Laban. Additionally, it may also symbolize Jacob's acknowledgement of God's presence in his life. Genesis chapter 31 verse 46. And Jacob said unto his brethren, Gather stones. And they took stones, and made a heap. And they did eat there upon the heap. Context. Genesis chapter 31 records the story of Jacob's departure from Laban, his father-in-law, along with his wives, children, and possessions. Laban pursued Jacob, but God warned Laban in a dream not to harm him. Eventually, Jacob and Laban made a covenant and set up a heap of stones as a witness to their agreement. Symbolism of the heap of stones. The heap of stones that Jacob and his brethren made symbolizes several significant aspects. Witness and remembrance. Throughout the Old Testament, stones were often used as a memorial or witness to important events or agreements. The heap of stones served as a reminder of the covenant made between Jacob and Laban. It marked the spot where they made peace and agreed not to harm each other. It would also serve as a reminder for future generations of God's faithfulness in preserving Jacob and his family. Boundary marker. The heap of stones served as a boundary marker between Jacob and Laban. It indicated the separation of their territories and marked the end of their conflict. This physical boundary reinforced the verbal agreement they made and helped to prevent future disputes. Fellowship and celebration. Jacob and his brethren ate upon the heap of stones. This act signified a communal meal and celebration of the covenant they had made. It represented reconciliation and the restoration of peaceful relations between them. Lessons and applications. Remembering God's faithfulness. The heap of stones reminds us of the importance of remembering and acknowledging God's faithfulness in our lives. Just as Jacob and Laban set up the heap as a memorial, we should take time to remember the ways God has been faithful to us, the promises He has fulfilled, and the covenants He has made with us. Pursuing reconciliation. The story of Jacob and Laban demonstrates the importance of seeking reconciliation and peace in our relationships. It is not always easy, but making efforts to resolve conflicts and restore broken relationships can lead to healing and blessings. Setting boundaries. The heap of stones as a boundary marker teaches us the importance of establishing healthy boundaries in our relationships. Boundaries help maintain clear expectations and prevent misunderstandings, enabling us to live in harmony with others. Communal fellowship and celebration. The act of eating together on the heap of stones emphasizes the significance of fellowship and celebration within a community. It reminds us to value and appreciate the relationships we have and to express gratitude for the unity and peace we experience. In summary, Genesis chapter 31 verse 46 illustrates the significance of the heap of stones as a witness to the covenant and agreement made between Jacob and Laban. It symbolizes remembrance, boundaries, fellowship, and celebration. We can learn from this passage by remembering God's faithfulness, pursuing reconciliation, setting healthy boundaries, and cherishing communal fellowship and celebration. Genesis chapter 31 verse 47. And Laban called it Jegar-sahadathah, but Jacob called it Galeed. Context. In Genesis chapter 31, we find the story of Jacob and his father-in-law Laban. Jacob had served Laban for many years and desired to return to his homeland with his family. Laban pursued him, and after a confrontation, they made a covenant of peace. As a part of this covenant, they set up a heap of stones as a witness to their agreement. The meaning of Jegar-sahadathah and Galeed. In this verse, Laban and Jacob each gave a different name to the heap of stones they erected. Laban called it Jegar-sahadathah, which is Aramaic for heap of witness, while Jacob called it Galeed, which is Hebrew for heap of witness. This naming reflects the different languages spoken by Laban, Aramaic, and Jacob, Hebrew, and emphasizes the significance of the event to both of them. Symbolism and significance. The heap of stones served as a physical marker or memorial of the covenant between Laban and Jacob. It represented a boundary and a witness to their agreement. Naming the heap in different languages highlights the distinct perspectives and cultural backgrounds of Laban and Jacob, yet they agreed on its purpose, to serve as a testimony to their covenant. Lessons and applications. Importance of establishing boundaries. The heap of stones symbolizes the importance of setting boundaries and making agreements in relationships. Just as Laban and Jacob used the stones to mark the limits of their interactions, we should establish clear boundaries in our relationships to foster healthy communication and mutual respect. Respecting differences. Laban and Jacob had different cultural backgrounds and languages, but they were able to find common ground and reach a peaceful resolution. This teaches us the value of respecting and understanding the perspectives of others, even when they differ from our own. Remembering God's faithfulness. Throughout the Bible, heaps of stones were often erected to commemorate significant encounters with God or important events. Similarly, in our lives, it is essential to remember and celebrate the faithfulness of God in our personal journeys and the milestones we've experienced along the way. Overall message: Genesis chapter 31 verse 47 reminds us of the importance of establishing boundaries, respecting differences, and commemorating significant moments in our relationships and spiritual journeys. It encourages us to be intentional in our interactions, seek peace, and acknowledge God's faithfulness. Remember, while this analysis provides insights into the verse, it's always beneficial to read and study the entire chapter and surrounding context to gain a comprehensive understanding of the passage. Genesis chapter 31 verse 48. And Laban said, "This heap is a witness between me and thee this day." Therefore was the name of it called Galeed. Genesis chapter 31 verse 48 is part of the narrative describing the events that took place between Jacob and his father-in-law, Laban. To understand the verse better, let's provide some context. In this chapter, Jacob decides to leave Laban's house and return to his homeland, taking along his wives, children, and possessions. Laban pursued Jacob but was warned by God in a dream not to harm him. Eventually, Jacob and Laban meet and agree to make a covenant, establishing boundaries and a witness between them. In verse 46, Jacob sets up a heap of stones as a boundary marker, and he tells his relatives that it serves as a witness between him and Laban. In verse 48, Laban acknowledges this and says, "This heap is a witness between me and thee this day." He then gives it a name, Galeed, which means heap of witness in Hebrew. The significance of this act lies in the cultural and legal context of the time. In ancient Near Eastern cultures, such as the one in which Jacob and Laban lived, covenants were often made and confirmed through various means. One common practice was setting up a physical monument, such as a heap of stones, as a visible reminder and witness of the agreement between the parties involved. By naming the heap Galeed, Laban solidifies its purpose as a witness marker. It symbolizes the commitment and agreement made between Jacob and Laban. The naming of the heap serves as a reminder of their mutual promises and obligations and acts as a testimony in case of any future disputes or conflicts. This verse teaches us a few important lessons. Firstly, it shows the importance of integrity and keeping one's word. Jacob and Laban set up this monument to ensure that their agreement would be remembered and honored by future generations. It emphasizes the value of trust and the need for external evidence to support their covenant. Secondly, it highlights the significance of physical symbols and acts in establishing and reinforcing agreements. Throughout the Bible, we see various instances where people use tangible objects, rituals, or markers to signify important events or commitments. These serve as reminders and aids to faith and memory. Finally, this verse also demonstrates the faithfulness of God in protecting and guiding his people. In the previous verses, God had appeared to Laban in a dream, warning him not to harm Jacob. This intervention by God ensured the safety of Jacob and his family. It reminds us that God is actively involved in the affairs of his people, even in difficult and uncertain situations. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 31 verse 48 recounts the establishment of a witness heap between Jacob and Laban, symbolizing their covenant. It underscores the importance of integrity, physical symbols, and the faithfulness of God. Genesis chapter 31 verse 49. And Mitzpah. For he said, "The Lord watch between me and thee when we are absent one from another." Context: Genesis chapter 31 verse 49 is part of the narrative of Jacob's departure from Laban's household. Jacob had worked for his uncle Laban for 20 years and decided to return to his homeland with his wives and children. Before leaving, Jacob and Laban made a covenant, which included setting up a heap of stones as a witness between them. This verse records Jacob's words as he named the heap of stones, Mitzpah. Mitzpah's meaning: the word Mitzpah means watchtower or watchpost. Jacob named the heap of stones Mitzpah because he wanted it to serve as a reminder of God's watchful presence. Jacob acknowledged that even when they were physically separated, God would be watching over both him and Laban. It was a recognition of God's omniscience and omnipresence. Spiritual lessons. Trust in God's presence. Jacob's use of the term mitzvah reminds us that God is always present in our lives, even when we are physically separated from loved ones or going through challenging circumstances. We can take comfort in the fact that God watches over us and is aware of our situation. God as a witness. The heap of stones symbolized a witness between Jacob and Laban, reminding him of their covenant. In a similar way, mitzvah can serve as a reminder that God is the ultimate witness to our commitments and promises. It encourages us to be faithful in our relationships and dealings with others, knowing that God is aware of our actions. Prayer for protection. Mitzvah can also remind us of the importance of praying for the well-being and protection of our loved ones when we are separated from them. Just as Jacob invoked God's presence and watchfulness, we can lift up prayers for God's care and guidance over those who are far from us. Application. Trusting God's presence. When you find yourself separated from loved ones or facing challenging situations, remember that God is with you. Take comfort in His watchful care and seek His guidance. Faithfulness in relationships. Reflect on the significance of your commitments and promises. Strive to maintain faithfulness and integrity in your relationships, knowing that God is the ultimate witness to your actions. Praying for others. Make it a habit to pray for the well-being, protection, and guidance of your loved ones, especially when you are physically separated from them. Seek God's blessings upon their lives. Remember that the ultimate message of the Bible is to draw us closer to God, deepen our understanding of His character, and guide us in living out our faith. May this study on Genesis chapter 31 verse 49 encourage you to trust in God's presence, be faithful in your relationships, and seek His guidance and protection in your life. Genesis chapter 31 verse 50. If thou shalt afflict my daughters, or if thou shalt take other wives beside my daughters, no man is with us. See, God is witness betwixt me and thee. Genesis chapter 31 verse 50 is part of the narrative concerning Jacob and Laban. In this verse, Laban confronts Jacob after they make a covenant of peace. Laban expresses his concerns regarding the treatment of his daughters and the possibility of Jacob taking additional wives. Context: Jacob had been working for his uncle Laban for many years and had married Laban's daughters, Leah and Rachel. During his time with Laban, Jacob faced numerous challenges, including Laban's deceitfulness and manipulation. Eventually, God instructed Jacob to return to his homeland, and Jacob decided to leave without informing Laban. Laban's affliction. Laban, upon discovering that Jacob had left with his family and possessions, pursued him and caught up to him in the mountains of Gilead. Laban confronted Jacob about his departure and accused him of stealing his household gods. However, Jacob was unaware that Rachel had taken them. Covenant of peace. After their confrontation, Jacob and Laban decided to make a covenant, which would ensure that they would live in peace and not harm each other. They set up a heap of stones as a witness and a boundary marker between their territories. Laban's concerns. In Genesis chapter 31 verse 50, Laban expressed his concerns to Jacob regarding the treatment of his daughters. He warned Jacob not to mistreat his daughters or take other wives besides them. Laban acknowledges that no one else is present as a witness to their agreement but emphasizes that God is the ultimate witness between them. Cultural context. In the culture of that time, it was not uncommon for men to have multiple wives. However, Laban wanted to ensure that Jacob would not take additional wives from outside Laban's family, which could potentially cause further tension and conflicts between them. God as witness. Laban's invocation of God as a witness underscores the seriousness and importance of the covenant they were making. He recognized that God, who sees and knows all things, would hold him accountable for their actions. This verse highlights Laban's concerns for the well-being of his daughters and his desire to protect their interests. It also emphasizes the significance of making covenants and the involvement of God as a witness in matters of human relationships and agreements. Genesis chapter 31 verse 50 teaches us the importance of treating others with respect and fairness, particularly in family relationships. It reminds us to consider the well-being and feelings of those around us, especially when it comes to our interactions with spouses, children, and extended family members. Genesis chapter 31 verse 51. And Laban said to Jacob, Behold this heap, and behold this pillar, which I have cast betwixt me and thee. Context: Genesis chapter 31 recounts the story of Jacob's departure from Laban's household. Laban had deceived Jacob multiple times, and God instructed Jacob to return to his homeland. Before leaving, Jacob and Laban made a covenant, a formal agreement to establish peace and set boundaries between them. The heap and the pillar. In this verse, Laban points out two physical objects, a heap of stones and a pillar. These objects served as a memorial and a physical marker of their covenant. The heap of stones represented a boundary that neither Jacob nor Laban would cross to harm each other. The pillar was a visible symbol of the agreement made between them. Symbolism: the heap and the pillar had symbolic significance beyond their physical presence. They represented a mutual understanding, a dividing line between Jacob and Laban. They signified the end of their conflicts and the resolution to their disputes. The heap and the pillar served as a reminder of their agreement and a deterrent against future hostilities. Lessons for us: conflict resolution. Jacob and Laban's example teaches us the importance of resolving conflicts and establishing peace. Instead of perpetuating animosity, they chose to create a physical reminder of their reconciliation. As Christians, we are called to seek reconciliation and forgiveness, to resolve conflicts in a spirit of love and peace. Boundaries and agreements. The heap and the pillar were physical boundaries that both parties agreed not to cross. It is essential to establish healthy boundaries in our relationships, respecting each other's personal space, emotional well-being, and autonomy. Clear agreements can help prevent misunderstandings and conflicts. Remembering God's work. Throughout the Bible, physical objects and rituals often served as reminders of God's faithfulness and His covenant with His people. In a similar way, the heap and the pillar reminded Jacob and Laban of their covenant and the transformative work of God in their lives. As believers, we can establish spiritual markers, such as prayer altars, sacraments, or significant milestones, to remind us of God's faithfulness in our lives. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 31 verse 51 captures the moment when Jacob and Laban established a covenant and set physical markers, a heap of stones and a pillar, as a testimony of their agreement. This verse emphasizes the importance of conflict resolution, setting healthy boundaries, and remembering God's faithfulness. Genesis chapter 31 verse 52. This heap be witness, and this pillar be witness, that I will not pass over this heap to thee, and that thou shalt not pass over this heap and this pillar unto me, for harm. Context: Genesis chapter 31 tells the story of Jacob's departure from his father-in-law Laban's house. Jacob had been living with Laban for many years, serving him and taking care of his flocks. However, Laban's sons became envious of Jacob's increasing wealth and blessings from God, and there was tension between Jacob and Laban. Eventually, Jacob decides to leave and return to his homeland, taking his family, servants, and possessions with him. The heap and the pillar. In Genesis chapter 31 verses 46 through 48, Jacob and Laban set up a heap of stones as a boundary marker and a pillar as a witness to their agreement. The heap and the pillar were physical symbols of the covenant they made with each other. Jacob declared that he would not pass over the heap to harm Laban, and Laban made the same declaration. They intended to respect the boundary set by the heap and pillar as a sign of their agreement. Covenant and promise. Jacob's statement in Genesis chapter 31 verse 52 reflects the commitment he made to Laban. By saying, "That I will not pass over this heap to thee, and that thou shalt not pass over this heap and this pillar unto me, for harm," Jacob affirms his intention not to harm Laban or cross the boundary set by the heap and pillar. This covenant was made in the presence of God as their witness. Honoring agreements. Jacob's words demonstrate the importance of honoring agreements and keeping one's promises. Despite the difficulties and conflicts Jacob had experienced with Laban, he desired to maintain peace and avoid any harm. The heap and pillar served as a constant reminder of their agreement and as a deterrent against any potential hostility. Application: the passage teaches us the value of integrity and maintaining peaceful relationships. It reminds us to honor our commitments and agreements, even in challenging circumstances. We should strive to keep our promises and act with fairness and respect toward others. Additionally, the passage highlights the significance of setting boundaries and making clear agreements to avoid misunderstandings and conflicts. In summary, Genesis chapter 31 verse 52 emphasizes the importance of keeping one's promises and honoring agreements. The heap and pillar served as a witness to the covenant between Jacob and Laban, signifying their commitment to avoid harm and respect the boundary established. This passage encourages us to act with integrity, maintain peaceful relationships, and honor our agreements. Genesis chapter 31 verse 53. The God of Abraham, and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge betwixt us. And Jacob sware by the fear of his father Isaac. This verse occurs in the context of a significant event in the life of Jacob. It takes place after Jacob had spent 20 years working for his father-in-law Laban, who had deceived him multiple times. In Genesis chapter 31, Jacob decides to leave Laban's house and return to his homeland, taking with him his wives, children, and possessions. However, Laban pursues Jacob and catches up with him. In this verse, we see Jacob's response to Laban's accusation and his desire for reconciliation. Let's break it down. Acknowledgement of God. Jacob begins by acknowledging the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, who is their common ancestor. This recognition highlights Jacob's understanding of God's role as the ultimate authority and judge. It also emphasizes the shared heritage and faith that Jacob and Laban have. Appeal for divine judgment. Jacob then states, "The God of their father, judge betwixt us." Here, Jacob appeals to God to act as the impartial judge between him and Laban. By doing so, Jacob recognizes that only God has the ultimate authority to settle the disputes between them fairly. He places his trust in divine justice rather than relying on his own strength or cunning. Jacob's oath. Finally, Jacob makes a solemn oath by swearing by the fear of his father Isaac. This phrase refers to the reverence and respect Jacob has for his father. By swearing in his father's name, Jacob underscores the seriousness of his oath and his commitment to keeping his word. This verse reflects Jacob's desire for a just resolution to the conflict between him and Laban. Despite the tensions and grievances, Jacob recognizes the need to appeal to God as the ultimate arbiter of justice. By invoking God's name and swearing by the fear of his father Isaac, Jacob demonstrates his willingness to seek reconciliation and trust in divine judgment. This passage also serves as a reminder for us to approach conflicts and disputes in our lives with a reliance on God's wisdom and justice. It encourages us to seek peaceful resolutions, acknowledging God's authority as the ultimate judge and trusting in His guidance. Overall, Genesis chapter 31 verse 53 highlights the importance of seeking God's intervention and committing to fair resolutions in times of conflict. Genesis chapter 31 verse 54. Then Jacob offered sacrifice upon the mount, and called his brethren to eat bread, and they did eat bread, and tarried all night in the mount. This verse is part of the narrative of Jacob's departure from Laban's house and his journey back to his homeland. To understand the significance of this verse, let's explore the context and the key themes surrounding it. In the preceding verses, Jacob and Laban made a covenant with each other, agreeing to set boundaries and no longer harm one another. They erected a heap of stones as a witness to their covenant and named it Galeed. After this reconciliation, Laban departed and returned to his place, and Jacob continued his journey. In verse 54, we find Jacob offering a sacrifice upon the mount. This act of sacrifice demonstrates Jacob's gratitude and devotion to God for his faithfulness and protection throughout his time with Laban. Sacrifices were a common practice in the Old Testament, serving as a means of worship and offering to God. By offering this sacrifice, Jacob acknowledges God's hand in his journey and seeks to express his reverence. Furthermore, Jacob called his brethren to eat bread. This act of sharing a meal signifies fellowship and unity among his family. In the ancient Near Eastern culture, sharing a meal often symbolized reconciliation and the establishment of peaceful relationships. By inviting his brethren to eat bread, Jacob signifies the restoration of harmony and kinship among them. The mention that they tarried all night in the mount indicates that they spent the night there. This detail may suggest that they lingered in the place of the sacrifice and fellowship, further emphasizing the importance of the occasion. It could also signify a time of rest and reflection, allowing Jacob and his family to dwell on the significance of the covenant and the providence of God. In summary, Genesis chapter 31 verse 54 portrays Jacob's act of offering a sacrifice to God, inviting his brethren to share a meal, and spending the night on the mount. These actions highlight Jacob's gratitude towards God, the restoration of unity within his family, and the importance of fellowship and reflection. This verse demonstrates the significance of worship, reconciliation, and the acknowledgement of God's faithfulness in our lives. Genesis chapter 31 verse 55. And early in the morning Laban rose up, and kissed his sons and his daughters, and blessed them, and Laban departed, and returned unto his place. This verse is part of the account of Jacob's departure from his father-in-law Laban's house. To fully understand the significance of this verse, let's look at the broader context. In Genesis chapter 31, we read about Jacob's time working for Laban. Jacob had married Laban's daughters, Leah and Rachel, and had acquired a considerable amount of livestock. However, Laban and his sons started to show hostility toward Jacob, and Jacob felt it was time to leave and return to his homeland. Before Jacob's departure, Laban and Jacob negotiate a settlement. They agree to a division of the livestock, and Jacob separates out his own flock. Laban suggests setting apart a specific group of animals as Laban's share, and Jacob agrees. Jacob then takes special care of his own flock, ensuring they are strong and healthy. Over time, Jacob's flock grows, while Laban's flock becomes weaker. In the verse in question, we see Laban rising early in the morning to bid farewell to his children. Laban kisses his sons and daughters and blesses them, indicating a farewell and a parting blessing. After this, Laban departs and returns to his own place. This verse showcases several aspects worth noting. Laban's blessing. Laban, despite the strained relationship he had with Jacob, blesses his children before departing. This act of blessing can be seen as a gesture of goodwill and a sign of reconciliation. Family bonds. The act of kissing Laban's sons and daughters reflects the family ties between Laban and his children. It highlights the emotional connection and affection shared among family members. Closure and separation. Laban's departure signifies the end of his presence in Jacob's life. After Jacob's time in Laban's household, this marks a significant turning point. Jacob can now move forward on his journey back to the land of his fathers. God's providence. Although not explicitly mentioned in this verse, the broader context of the story reveals God's hand in Jacob's life. God had promised to be with Jacob and bless him, Genesis chapter 28 verses 13 through 15, and throughout the narrative, we see God's faithfulness, protection, and provision for Jacob. Genesis chapter 31 verse 55 serves as a transition point in the story of Jacob and Laban. Laban's departure paves the way for Jacob to continue his journey, ultimately fulfilling God's plan for his life. It also demonstrates the importance of family relationships and the significance of blessings within the biblical context.